Imagine a world where magnificent palaces stretch across sun-drenched landscapes, where scribes record the movements of gold and ivory in mysterious scripts, where bronze-armored warriors ride chariots across well-traveled roads connecting mighty empires. Then imagine it all disappearing. In the span of little more than a century, this glittering Bronze Age world, humanity's first truly interconnected civilization, crumbled into dust and shadow. Cities burned, palaces fell silent, writing systems vanished. Trade routes that had carried precious goods across vast distances for centuries simply stopped. This is the story of one of history's greatest mysteries, the Bronze Age collapse. A tale of climate change and warfare, of systemic failure and human resilience, of the end of one world and the violent birth of another. 1. The Great Temporal Divide. The sun was setting on more than just another day when the Bronze Age world began its final, catastrophic transformation. Between 1250 and 1150 BCE, a century that would become known as humanity's first great collapse, the sophisticated palace civilizations that had dominated the Eastern Mediterranean for nearly 1,000 years began to crumble like ancient parchment touched by flame. This wasn't the work of a single catastrophic year, though for centuries scholars believed it was. The evidence tells a far more complex and haunting story. Using advanced radiocarbon dating, ceramic analysis, and meticulous stratigraphic excavation, modern archaeologists have revealed that this collapse unfolded like a slow-motion earthquake, each tremor weakening the foundations of civilization until the entire structure came crashing down. What makes this period so remarkable and so terrifying is its scope. This wasn't just one kingdom falling or one city burning. From the palaces of Mycenaean Greece to the mighty Hittite Empire, from the trading ports of the Levant to the administrative centers of Egypt, an entire world order was dissolving before the eyes of those who lived through it. 2. The archaeological detective story. In the quiet halls of archaeological institutes today, a revolution has been unfolding. Dr. Jesse Millick, armed with decades of excavation reports and a detective skepticism, began questioning everything scholars thought they knew about the Bronze Age collapse. What he discovered in 2023 would shake the very foundations of Bronze Age studies. Picture Millick poring over dusty excavation reports, cross-referencing pottery sherds, and tracking down forgotten site photographs. Site by site, destruction by destruction, he began to uncover a startling truth. Of the 153 destruction events that had shaped our understanding of the collapse, only 59 actually happened. 61% of the evidence for this great catastrophe was built on assumptions, misdated artifacts, or scholarly tradition rather than hard archaeological proof. Cities that generations of students had learned were destroyed by the Sea Peoples were actually abandoned peacefully. Burn layers attributed to enemy attacks turned out to be later fires or natural disasters. This wasn't just an academic correction. It was a complete rewriting of history. Millick's work revealed how decades of scholars had unconsciously created a narrative of universal destruction that exceeded what the ground actually told us. The collapse was real, but it was far more complex, nuanced, and regionally varied than anyone had imagined. 3. The Mycenaean domino effect. The great palaces of Mycenaean Greece didn't fall in a single night of fire and sword, as ancient legends might suggest. Instead, they collapsed in a tragic sequence that played out over nearly a century, each destruction weakening the network that held their world together. Thebes was the first major domino to fall. This powerful center, which had rivaled even mighty Mycenae itself, endured repeated attacks between 1300 and 1200 BCE. Each assault left scars, burnt timbers, scattered pottery, hastily buried treasures. The final blow came around 1200 BCE, when Thebes was utterly destroyed and never rebuilt to its former magnificence. But perhaps no site tells the story more dramatically than Mycenae itself. In 1250 BCE, the earth literally opened up beneath the great citadel. A massive earthquake brought down walls, collapsed roofs, and crushed human beings where they stood. Their skeletons found centuries later, still pinned beneath the stones that killed them. The survivors rebuilt. They had no choice. For 40 years, life continued in the shadow of the Great Lion Gate. But in 1190 BCE, fire completed what the earthquake had begun. This time, there would be no rebuilding. The age of the great Mycenaean palaces was over. 4. The Hittite Empire's slow death. Far to the east, in the highlands of Anatolia, the mighty Hittite Empire was dying by degrees. This wasn't the dramatic collapse that popular imagination might conjure. No sudden invasion, no single devastating battle. Instead, it was a slow hemorrhaging of power that makes the Hittite collapse all the more haunting. By 1200 BCE, the empire that had once negotiated as equals with Egypt and challenged Assyria for dominance was fragmenting under pressures, both internal and external. The capital city of Hattusa wasn't stormed by enemies. It was gradually abandoned by its own people, a process that unfolded over several decades like a great city slowly bleeding to death. Recent scientific analysis has revealed a crucial piece of this puzzle. Dendrochronological studies, reading the story written in ancient tree rings, have identified a severe 3-year drought from 1198 to 1196 BCE. This wasn't just a bad harvest or two. This was ecological catastrophe. Wells ran dry, crops failed, and the agricultural foundation that supported the empire's vast bureaucracy simply crumbled. The Hittite records themselves tell the story of desperation. Letters survive, showing officials desperately requesting grain, begging for food aid, watching helplessly as their administrative system collapsed under the weight of environmental crisis. The empire didn't fall to foreign conquest. It starved to death. 5. Egypt, the wounded survivor. While kingdoms crumbled around them, the Egyptians faced the storm and survived, but at a terrible cost. The land of the pharaohs would endure the Bronze Age collapse, but it would emerge forever changed, like a warrior bearing permanent scars from battles that nearly destroyed them. The threat came from the sea, literally. The mysterious sea peoples, whose identity still puzzles scholars today, launched 2 major invasions that tested Egypt's military might to its limits. The first assault came under Pharaoh Merneptah around 1208 BCE, a massive coordinated attack that Egyptian records describe with barely concealed terror. But it was the second invasion, under Ramesses III in 1177 BCE, that truly tested Egyptian civilization. This wasn't just a raid or a single battle. It was a sustained campaign that required every ounce of Egypt's military and economic strength to repel. The famous Battle of Jahi and the decisive Battle of the Delta saw Egyptian forces pushed to their absolute limits. Victory came, but at what cost? The military campaigns had drained the royal treasury, exhausted the army, and revealed Egypt's vulnerability to future attacks. While the pharaohs could claim triumph over the sea peoples, their weakened kingdom would soon fragment into the chaotic Third Intermediate Period, marking the end of Egypt's days as a great international power. 6. The sequence of collapse. Understanding the Bronze Age collapse requires seeing it not as a single event, but as a carefully choreographed dance of destruction that moved across the eastern Mediterranean like a slow-motion tsunami. Each wave of collapse weakened the next region's ability to resist, creating a domino effect that would ultimately bring down the entire system. The sequence begins in the Greek heartland, where Mycenaean palace centers started falling between 1250 and 1180 BCE. These weren't just local disasters. They were the failure of crucial nodes in an international trade network. When Pylos burned and Mycenae fell, the ripple effects traveled along trade routes like shock waves through water. Next came the Hittite imperial fragmentation between 1200 and 1180 BCE. As the great empire of Anatolia dissolved, it left a power vacuum that destabilized the entire region. Trading partners lost their contacts, diplomatic relationships crumbled, and the careful balance of power that had maintained peace for generations simply disappeared. Finally, The Levantine city-states began their own collapse between 1185 and 1180 BCE. Cities like Ugarit, which had survived as neutral trading posts even as empires fell around them, finally succumbed to the chaos. The last links in the Great Bronze Age network were breaking, leaving behind isolated communities struggling to survive in a world that no longer made sense. 7. The testimony of Ugarit. Deep beneath the soil of modern Syria, Claude Schaefer's patient excavations from 1929 to 1970 uncovered one of archaeology's most poignant testimonies to the Bronze Age collapse. At Ugarit, the great trading port that had once buzzed with merchants speaking a dozen languages, Schaefer found something that chilled him to the bone. Above the normal occupation layers, the everyday detritus of centuries of peaceful life, lay something entirely different. A destruction layer up to 2 meters thick, composed of what Schaefer described as fine, powdery, homogeneous soil, pale yellow or frequently whitish in color. It was the cremated remains of civilization, ground to dust in a single catastrophic event around 1200 BCE. The pottery told the story with scientific precision. The latest vessels were late Helladic IIB style, but there was no LHIIC pottery at all. This meant the destruction happened at a very specific moment in time, cutting off Ugarit's connections to the Mycenaean world with surgical precision. But perhaps most haunting of all, this great international port, which had survived wars, famines, and political upheavals for centuries, was never rebuilt. The 2-meter-thick layer of destruction debris marks not just the end of a city, but the end of an entire way of life. 8. The burning of Hattusa. In the Anatolian highlands, where the German Archaeological Institute has been digging since 1931, another story of destruction emerged from the ancient stones. Hattusa, the mighty capital of the Hittite Empire, tells its tale not in whispers, but in the charred remains of an administrative system that once ruled from the Black Sea to the borders of Egypt. The excavations revealed a city consumed by fire in the late 13th century BCE. But this wasn't random destruction. It was systematic, almost surgical in its completeness. Most striking of all were the massive grain storage facilities, testament to the empire's sophisticated agricultural management. A built silo structure measuring 118 meters by 40 meters contained 32 rectangular chambers, 12 of which held their final contents forever preserved by the flames that destroyed them. Charred grain, burned in the very moment of the city's destruction, provides a haunting snapshot of normal life interrupted by catastrophe. These weren't empty storehouses. They were full of the harvest that was meant to feed the empire through another winter. The abundance of stored grain makes the abandonment all the more mysterious and tragic. The German excavators found evidence of careful preparation before the final burning. Valuable materials had been removed, important documents taken away. This wasn't a surprise attack. It was an organized abandonment, suggesting the Hittites knew their time was ending. 9. Hazor's violent end. At Tel Hazor in modern Israel, excavations led first by Yigal Yadin in the 1950s and 1960s, then continued by Amnon Bentor from 1990 onward, uncovered one of the most dramatic destruction scenes in all of Bronze Age archaeology. Here, unlike some sites where the evidence is subtle or debated, the violence is unmistakable and overwhelming. The destruction layer tells a story of systematic violence and deliberate desecration. Ash deposits reached 3 feet deep in some areas. Evidence of fires so intense they altered the very chemistry of the soil. Basalt architectural elements, stone blocks that should have lasted for millennia, were found cracked and shattered by extreme heat. But perhaps most chilling were the deliberately mutilated statues discovered throughout the site. Divine images and royal monuments had their heads and hands carefully severed, not damaged by accident or warfare, but methodically destroyed in what appears to have been a systematic campaign of cultural erasure. Recent microgeoarchaeological analysis has confirmed the excavators' worst suspicions. Using 89 bulk sediment samples, researchers mapped the destruction across the entire site, revealing a deposit 1.5 meters thick of collapsed, burnt mud bricks. The fire that destroyed Hazor was so intense, so complete, that it literally baked the clay architecture into pottery, preserving the moment of destruction for archaeologists to discover 3 millennia later. 10. The Palace of Nestor's Final Hour. At Pylos, on the western coast of the Peloponnese, Carl Blegen's excavations in the 1950s uncovered one of archaeology's most fortunate accidents. The Palace of Nestor, named for the wise king of Homer's Iliad, met its end around 1180 BCE in a fire so intense it accidentally preserved one of Bronze Age Greece's greatest treasures. The flames that destroyed the palace did something remarkable. They baked more than 1,000 clay tablets that would otherwise have crumbled to dust centuries ago. These weren't just any documents. They were the administrative records of a functioning Bronze Age kingdom, frozen at the moment of destruction like a photograph of normal life interrupted by catastrophe. Among these tablets was the famous tripod tablet, PY-TAS 641, inscribed by scribes including one known to modern scholars simply as Hand II, possibly a man named Fugiberus, whose personal writing style archaeologists can recognize across multiple documents. These scribes were recording the mundane business of palace administration: inventories of bronze vessels, records of textile production, lists of livestock, right up until the moment the palace burned around them. The preservation of these Linear B tablets through accidental firing has given us an unparalleled window into the final moments of Mycenaean civilization. They show a kingdom functioning normally, collecting taxes, managing resources, maintaining diplomatic relations, and then, suddenly, silence. 11. Troy's stubborn survival. While other great centers of Bronze Age civilization burned and were abandoned forever, Troy tells a different story, one of resilience and stubborn determination to survive in a collapsing world. Manfred Korfmann's exhaustive excavations from 1988 to 2005 revealed that Troy VI was indeed destroyed around 1200 BCE, but what happened next sets it apart from almost every other major Bronze Age site. The archaeological evidence speaks of violence. Spearheads scattered throughout the destruction layers tell of hand-to-hand combat in the city's final hours. Someone fought desperately to defend these walls, and someone else fought just as desperately to take them. The burned ruins and embedded weapons paint a picture of siege warfare that would have been worthy of Homer's epic poetry. But here's what makes Troy unique. They rebuilt immediately. While Mycenae lay in ruins, while Hattusa was abandoned to the wind and rain, while Ugarit disappeared beneath the sand, the Trojans cleared away the debris of their destroyed city and started building again. This wasn't just stubborn pride, it was strategic necessity. Troy's location at the entrance to the Dardanelles made it too valuable to abandon. 12. The miracle of Linear B. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Bronze Age collapse is how it accidentally created one of our greatest windows into the lost world it destroyed. The Linear B tablets, those clay records of palace administration found at Knossos, Pylos, Thebes, and Mycenae, exist today only because the fires that ended Mycenaean civilization happened to bake them into pottery hard permanence. Think about the irony. These tablets were never meant to last. They were the equivalent of office memos, temporary records that palace scribes would normally erase and reuse when the information became outdated. They survived because the buildings that housed them burned so intensely that they accidentally fired the clay tablets like pottery in a kiln. When Michael Ventris and John Chadwick deciphered Linear B in 1952, they made a discovery that revolutionized our understanding of Bronze Age Greece. These tablets weren't written in some unknown language. They recorded Mycenaean Greek, proving that the Greek language had survived the collapse even when Greek civilization itself seemed to disappear. For 400 years after the collapse, Greece had no writing system at all. The sophisticated scribal schools that had maintained Linear B literacy were destroyed, their knowledge lost. 13. Scientific confirmation at Hazor. Sometimes modern science can reach back across millennia to confirm the fears and discoveries of earlier archaeologists. At Hazor, Recent microgeoarchaeological analysis has done exactly that, using cutting-edge techniques to verify the dramatic destruction that Yigal-Yadin first uncovered in the 1950s. The 2019 study, led by Beecher and his team, represents a new level of scientific precision in understanding ancient destruction. They collected 89 bulk sediment samples from across the site, creating a detailed map of how the destruction unfolded. What they found was both fascinating and terrifying. A uniform deposit 1.5 meters thick of collapsed, burnt mud bricks extending across the entire excavated area. This wasn't just a localized fire or accidental conflagration. The uniform thickness and composition of the destruction layer indicates a systematic, coordinated burning that consumed the entire city in a single event. The intensity of the fire was so extreme that it transformed the clay architecture into something resembling pottery, creating a kind of archaeological time capsule. The scientific analysis confirmed what earlier excavators had suspected but couldn't prove with 1950s technology. Hazor had been deliberately and methodically destroyed in what can only be described as an act of urban annihilation. The destroyers hadn't just wanted to conquer the city, they had wanted to erase it. 14. Dating the destruction. The science of archaeological dating has undergone a revolution in recent decades, and nowhere is this more apparent than in our understanding of when exactly the Bronze Age collapse occurred. New AMS, accelerator mass spectrometry, radiocarbon dates from key sites like Eklena and Pylos have provided unprecedented precision in dating these ancient catastrophes. The work by Cosmopoulos and his team in 2019 represents a breakthrough in Mycenaean chronology. By analyzing organic materials found in direct association with destruction layers, they've been able to establish dates that are accurate to within decades rather than centuries. The Palace of Nestor's destruction, for example, can now be pinpointed to around 1180 BCE with remarkable confidence. This precision matters enormously for understanding the collapse. Earlier dating methods often had margins of error spanning a century or more, making it difficult to establish whether destructions were simultaneous or sequential. The new high-precision dates reveal a more complex pattern. The collapse unfolded over several generations, with different regions falling at different times. The correlation with ceramic evidence and stratigraphic context has created what archaeologists call the high chronology for Mycenaean dating, a framework that shows the Bronze Age collapse was both more gradual and more precisely datable than previously imagined. 15. Ugarit's International Archive. In a house near the harbor of ancient Ugarit, archaeologists discovered what may be the most cosmopolitan archive from the entire Bronze Age. Over 5,000 tablets, written in multiple languages and scripts, document the incredible international connections that made Ugarit one of the ancient world's great trading hubs and help us understand exactly what was lost when the Bronze Age world collapsed. The languages alone tell the story of a truly global civilization. Ugaritic, written in a unique alphabetic cuneiform. Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the age. Hittite, Hurrian, and even Cypro-Minoan. Merchants and diplomats from across the known world conducted business in Ugarit's markets and palaces, creating a polyglot society that wouldn't be matched again for centuries. But it's the content of these archives that really brings the Bronze Age world to life. Letters between merchants arranging shipments of copper and tin, diplomatic correspondence between kings, legal contracts covering everything from marriage agreements to slave sales, and religious texts that reveal the complex spiritual world of Bronze Age Syria. The archive of merchant Erdenu alone contains 650 tablets documenting his correspondence with Egypt, Assyria, and the Hittite realm. His letters chart the transition from routine business to desperate requests for grain as famine spread across the region, providing a real-time account of a civilization under stress. 16. The Egyptian version of events. The story of the Sea Peoples begins with Egyptian propaganda, carved in stone on temple walls where pharaohs boasted of their victories to gods and men alike. The reliefs at Medinet Habu, commissioned by Ramesses III, show scenes of naval battles, foreign captives, and royal triumph. But they tell us as much about Egyptian fears as Egyptian victories. The Sea Peoples theory emerged in the 19th century when French Egyptologists Emmanuel de Rouge and Gaston Maspero began studying these dramatic temple inscriptions. What they found seemed to explain everything. Mysterious seafaring invaders sweeping across the eastern Mediterranean, destroying cities, toppling kingdoms, bringing the Bronze Age world to its knees. But modern scholars have learned to read Egyptian sources with careful skepticism. These weren't objective historical records. They were royal propaganda designed to glorify pharaonic power and intimidate Egypt's enemies. The dramatic battles, the total victories, the complete destruction of foreign enemies. All of this follows standard Egyptian literary conventions rather than necessarily reflecting historical reality. The reliefs show the Sea Peoples as a great undifferentiated mass of foreign enemies, but closer examination reveals something more complex. These weren't just warriors. They traveled with families, possessions, ox carts full of household goods. The Egyptian artists, perhaps despite themselves, had captured evidence of desperate migration. 17. A symptom, not a cause. Eric Klein, one of the world's leading experts on the Bronze Age collapse, has fundamentally reframed how we understand the Sea Peoples. Rather than seeing them as the primary cause of the collapse, Klein argues they were as much a symptom of the collapse as they were a cause, victims of the same forces that were destroying the Bronze Age world. Archaeological evidence supports this more nuanced view. When the Sea Peoples appear in Egyptian art and texts, they're traveling with families and possessions, their ox carts loaded with household goods and personal belongings. This isn't the equipment of a conquering army. It's the desperate migration of displaced populations seeking new homes in a collapsing world. Think about the implications. If the Sea Peoples were the cause of the Bronze Age collapse, where did they come from? What force was powerful enough to displace them from their original homes and send them wandering across the Mediterranean? The answer seems to be the same combination of climate change, political instability, and economic disruption that was affecting everyone else. Rather than mysterious foreign invaders appearing from nowhere, the Sea Peoples begin to look like refugees from the same systemic collapse that was destroying established kingdoms. They weren't the storm that sank the Bronze Age world. They were fellow passengers on a ship that was already sinking. 18. The Battle of Jahi, Egypt's border war. Around 1178 BCE, somewhere in the hills of southern Lebanon, two worlds collided in a battle that would determine whether Egyptian civilization survived the Bronze Age collapse. The Battle of Jahi saw Pharaoh Ramesses III face the Sea Peoples at Egypt's northeastern frontier, in a confrontation that Egyptian scribes recorded with barely concealed relief at their narrow victory. The Egyptian account, carved in stone at Medinet Habu, describes the careful preparations. Equipped my frontier in Zahi, prepared before them. This wasn't a surprise attack. Both sides knew the confrontation was coming and had time to prepare. Egyptian forces positioned themselves strategically, with charioteers ready to crush the countries under their feet. But reading between the lines of Egyptian propaganda, a more complex picture emerges. Why was this battle fought so far from Egypt's traditional borders? Why did the pharaoh feel the need to meet this threat in Lebanon rather than waiting for it to reach Egyptian soil? The answer suggests that the Sea Peoples' advance had been relentless and terrifying enough to force Egypt into a desperate preemptive strike. The battle itself seems to have been a close-run thing. Egyptian art shows the classic imagery of pharaonic triumph, but the fact that another, even larger battle would follow suggests that Jahi was more of a delaying action than a decisive victory. 19. The Battle of the Delta, naval warfare in ancient times. The year 1177 BCE witnessed one of the most decisive naval battles in ancient history, when Pharaoh Ramesses III faced the Sea Peoples in the marshy waterways of the Nile Delta. This wasn't just a battle for territory, it was a fight for the survival of Egyptian civilization itself, and the tactics employed reveal the sophistication of Bronze Age naval warfare. The Egyptian strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Rather than meeting the Sea People's ships in open water, Ramesses III lured them into the narrow channels and shallow waters of the Delta, where the Egyptians' knowledge of local conditions gave them a decisive advantage. Egyptian archers lined both shores of the waterways, creating deadly crossfire zones that the enemy ships couldn't escape. The Medinet Habu inscriptions record the pharaoh's satisfaction with the slaughter. Those who reach my boundary, their seed is not. Their hearts and their souls are finished forever and ever. This wasn't just military victory. It was the complete annihilation of an enemy force that had threatened to destroy everything the Egyptians held dear. But the cost of victory was enormous. The resources required to mobilize Egypt's entire military apparatus, outfit the fleet, and sustain the campaign had drained the royal treasury. Egypt had won the war, but lost its economic foundation for maintaining great power status in the ancient world. 20. The three campaigns of Ramesses III. The threat of the Sea Peoples wasn't resolved in a single dramatic confrontation, but required a sustained military effort that spanned most of Ramesses III's reign. The pharaoh fought three major campaigns against these mysterious invaders in years 5, 8, and 12 of his rule, corresponding to 1186, 1183, and 1179 BC, each revealing different aspects of the crisis gripping the Eastern Mediterranean. The Year 8 campaign is particularly revealing because Egyptian artists depicted the Sea Peoples traveling with their families in ox carts loaded with household possessions. This wasn't an army on the march. It was an entire population on the move, driven from their homeland by forces that remain mysterious even today. The repeated nature of these campaigns tells us something important about the Sea Peoples. They weren't a unified force under single leadership, but rather successive waves of displaced populations seeking new homes. Each time the Egyptians thought they had solved the problem, new groups would appear, driven by the same pressures that had displaced their predecessors. The fact that Ramesses III felt compelled to commemorate all three campaigns in his temple inscriptions suggests they were genuinely difficult victories rather than the routine frontier skirmishes that pharaohs often ignored. These battles stretched Egyptian military capacity to its limits and marked the beginning of Egypt's long decline from great power status. 21. The last king of Ugarit's desperate plea. Among the most poignant documents from the Bronze Age collapse are the final letters of Amurapi, last king of Ugarit, whose desperate correspondence provides a real-time account of a civilization under siege. His letters, discovered in the ruins of his palace, read like dispatches from a sinking ship, growing more frantic with each exchange. To his allies, Amurapi sent increasingly desperate pleas. Send me forces and chariots, and may my lord save me from the forces of this enemy. The formality of royal correspondence breaks down as panic sets in. These aren't the measured diplomatic exchanges typical of Bronze Age international relations. They're the words of a man watching his world collapse around him. Even more revealing is his letter to the king of Alatia, probably Cyprus. My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. The language is simple, direct, stripped of the usual royal bombast. This is a man reporting the destruction of his kingdom with the stark simplicity of shock and grief. What makes these letters so haunting is that we know how the story ends. The archaeological evidence shows that Ugarit was completely destroyed shortly after these letters were written, never to be rebuilt. Amurapi's desperate pleas went unanswered, and his great trading city joined the growing list of Bronze Age casualties. 22. The Climate Detective Story. In 2012, archaeologist Brandon Drake published research that would fundamentally change how we understand the Bronze Age collapse. Using multiple climate proxies, evidence from ice cores, tree rings, lake sediments, and ocean cores, Drake revealed that the early Iron Age was more arid than the preceding Bronze Age, providing the first comprehensive picture of the environmental crisis that may have triggered the collapse. Drake's analysis of oxygen isotope speleothems, cave formations that record ancient climate conditions, revealed a sharp increase in northern hemisphere temperatures just before the collapse, followed by rapid cooling. This climate whiplash would have been devastating for agricultural societies that had adapted their farming practices to more stable conditions. The timing is crucial. The climate shift begins just as the first Mycenaean palaces start to fall, suggesting that environmental stress may have been the initial trigger that set the collapse in motion. As crop yields declined and populations faced food shortages, the political and social tensions that would ultimately destroy Bronze Age civilization began to build. But Drake's research also reveals something more complex than simple climate determinism. The same climate changes affected regions differently. Some areas became drier, while others experienced flooding. Some faced immediate crisis, while others had time to adapt. The climate didn't destroy Bronze Age civilization directly. It created the conditions under which other pressures could become fatal. 23. The evidence from ancient trees. In 2023, a groundbreaking study led by Stuart Manning used an unexpected source to illuminate the Bronze Age collapse: the growth rings of trees that lived through the crisis. Published in the prestigious journal Nature, this research identified what may have been the environmental catastrophe that finally brought down the Hittite Empire. The tree ring analysis revealed unusually low growth, indicating drought conditions so severe they represented the driest the region had experienced in more than 6 centuries. This wasn't just a bad year or even a series of bad years. It was a multi-year ecological disaster that coincided precisely with the final collapse of Hittite power between 1198 and 1196 BCE. Think about what this means. Trees that had survived for centuries, weathering droughts, floods, and human conflicts, recorded growth patterns during these 3 years that were unlike anything in their lifespans. The environmental stress was so extreme that it left permanent scars in the wood itself, creating a precise chronological marker for one of history's great civilizational collapses. The correlation between the tree ring evidence and historical records is striking. These are the same years when Hittite texts record desperate requests for grain, when the empire's administrative system begins to break down, when the great capital of Hattusa is finally abandoned. The trees were witnessing and recording the environmental catastrophe that brought down one of the ancient world's great powers. 24. The 300-year drought. Sometimes environmental catastrophes unfold not in dramatic natural disasters, but in the slow grind of changing conditions that stress human societies beyond their breaking point. Research by Kanusky and his team, published in PLOS One, identified just such a mega-drought, a 300-year period of increased aridity that began around 1200 BCE and fundamentally altered the environmental conditions that had supported Bronze Age civilization. Using pollen records from Syria and Cyprus, the researchers were able to track changes in vegetation patterns that revealed a dramatic shift toward drier conditions. Forest cover declined, grasslands expanded, and the agricultural zones that had supported dense populations for centuries began to contract. This wasn't just meteorological change, it was ecological transformation. The human impact was devastating: crop failures, dearth, and famine, which precipitated or hastened socioeconomic crises and forced regional human migrations. Populations that had been stable for generations suddenly found themselves unable to maintain their traditional way of life. Some adapted by changing their agricultural practices. Others were forced to migrate in search of more favorable conditions. The 300-year time frame is crucial because it means this wasn't a temporary crisis that societies could wait out, but a permanent change that required fundamental adaptation. Those civilizations that couldn't or wouldn't adapt simply disappeared, while those that successfully transformed themselves became the foundation for Iron Age societies. 25. The Dead Sea's living memory. Deep beneath the waters of the Sea of Galilee, in sediment cores that read like pages from an ancient climate history book, scientists have discovered one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for the environmental crisis that accompanied the Bronze Age collapse. Radiocarbon dating of these sediment layers reveals that the period from 1250 to 1100 BCE was the driest of the entire Bronze Age. These lake sediments are like climate libraries, preserving evidence of rainfall patterns, drought conditions, and environmental change across millennia. The layers laid down during the Bronze Age collapse show unmistakable signs of extreme aridity, reduced water levels, concentrated minerals, and changes in the types of pollen deposited by wind from the surrounding landscape. What makes this evidence so powerful is its precision. Unlike many climate proxies that provide general trends over centuries, the Sea of Galilee cores can be dated to specific decades, allowing scientists to correlate environmental conditions with known historical events. The drought begins just as Mycenaean palaces start falling and intensifies during the period when the Hittite Empire fragments. The human implications of this evidence are staggering. The Sea of Galilee region was one of the most fertile and well-watered areas in the ancient Near East. If even this favored region was experiencing unprecedented drought, conditions in more marginal areas must have been catastrophic. The sediment cores are witnessing the environmental collapse that helped bring down a civilization. 26. The ocean's memory of crisis. The Mediterranean Sea itself holds memories of the Bronze Age collapse, locked in the chemistry of ancient seawater that reveals a climate catastrophe of unprecedented scope. Brandon Drake's analysis of sea surface temperatures shows a dramatic 3 to 4 degrees Celsius drop during the late Bronze Age collapse, a change so severe it would have fundamentally altered weather patterns across the entire eastern Mediterranean. This temperature drop created what climatologists call a feedback loop, a self-reinforcing cycle that made the crisis worse with each passing year. Cooler sea surfaces meant less evaporation, which meant less moisture in the atmosphere, which meant less rainfall over land. As the land became drier, it reflected more heat back to the atmosphere, cooling the sea surface even further. The result was a climate system locked into crisis mode, unable to return to the conditions that had supported Bronze Age civilization. Agricultural zones that had been reliable for centuries became unreliable. Trade routes that had followed predictable seasonal patterns became dangerous gambles. Populations that had grown comfortable with environmental stability found themselves facing unprecedented uncertainty. Perhaps most importantly, this wasn't a local phenomenon affecting just one region. It was a basin-wide environmental transformation that affected every Bronze Age civilization simultaneously. The interconnected nature of Bronze Age societies, which had been a source of strength during good times, became a vulnerability when environmental crisis struck everywhere at once. 27. Voices of desperation from the archives. In the ruins of Hattusa and other Hittite sites, archaeologists have uncovered letters that provide heartbreaking glimpses into the human cost of the environmental crisis. Official correspondence from the empire's final years reveals a bureaucracy struggling desperately to manage an ecological catastrophe that was beyond their technological capacity to solve. Letters from Suppiluliuma II to King Hammurapi of Ugarit contain urgent requests for grain provisions to relieve famine conditions. The usual diplomatic formalities give way to barely concealed desperation as officials plead for even the remainders of the grain staples. These aren't requests for luxury goods or tribute payments. They're appeals for basic survival. Contemporary texts describe widespread hunger using the Akkadian word bairu, a term that implies not just food shortage, but genuine starvation. Officials write of empty granaries, failed harvests, and populations on the move in search of food. The carefully maintained administrative system that had governed the Hittite Empire for centuries was breaking down under the weight of ecological crisis. What makes these letters so poignant is their mixture of bureaucratic language and human desperation. Even as the empire collapsed around them, officials continued to follow proper diplomatic protocols, addressing their correspondence with traditional titles and courtesies, while begging for the food that might keep their people alive. They were maintaining the forms of civilization even as its substance disappeared. 28. The theory of diminishing returns. Joseph Tainer's groundbreaking analysis of societal collapse provides a framework for understanding why Bronze Age civilizations couldn't adapt to the crisis that overwhelmed them. In his seminal work, The Collapse of Complex Societies, Tainer argues that Bronze Age civilizations had reached a point where their investments in social complexity and their energy subsidies reach a point of diminishing marginal returns. Think of it this way. Bronze Age palace societies had become increasingly elaborate and specialized over centuries of growth. They maintained large bureaucracies, complex redistributive systems, extensive military forces, and monumental architecture. All of this complexity required enormous amounts of resources and energy to maintain, but it also made these societies incredibly capable and resilient for a while. The problem came when external stresses, climate change, military pressure, economic disruption, required even greater investments in complexity to maintain stability. But at a certain point, these societies had already invested so heavily in their existing systems that further investment yielded diminishing returns. They were trapped by their own success. When crisis hit, these societies faced an impossible choice. Invest more resources in maintaining their complex systems, resources they didn't have, or simplify their organization, which meant abandoning the very features that made them powerful. Many chose to try to maintain complexity until their resources were exhausted, leading to sudden, catastrophic collapse rather than gradual adaptation. 29. The Small World Network Vulnerability. Eric Klein's research has revealed one of the most important insights into why the Bronze Age collapse was so comprehensive and devastating. Bronze Age Mediterranean civilizations had created what network theorists call a small world network, a highly interconnected system where every major center was closely linked to every other major center through trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. This network was Bronze Age civilization's greatest strength during stable times. A palace in Greece could obtain tin from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, gold from Egypt, and copper from Cyprus with remarkable efficiency. Ideas, technologies, and cultural innovations spread rapidly across vast distances. The system was resilient enough to handle local disruptions. If one trade route was blocked, alternatives existed. But this same interconnectedness became a fatal vulnerability when the crisis hit multiple nodes simultaneously. As Klein puts it, the loss of key cities destabilized the trade network and undermined state revenue. When Ugarit fell, it didn't just affect Syria, it disrupted trade networks stretching from Spain to Mesopotamia. When Mycenaean palaces burned, the effects rippled across the entire eastern Mediterranean. The Bronze Age had created the world's first truly global economy, but they had also created the world's first truly global economic collapse. The very features that had made their civilization so successful, specialization, interdependence, efficient long-distance exchange, made it impossible for any part of the system to survive when other parts failed. 30. The Synchronous Failures Model. Recent systems analysis by Centeno and his team has provided a sophisticated framework for understanding how the Bronze Age collapse unfolded. Their research identifies it as a case of synchronous failures driven by both long-term trends in interconnectedness and inequality, as well as external shocks, multiple crises hitting an already stressed system simultaneously. The model reveals how three types of pressures combined to create catastrophic system failure. Long-term trends, increasing social inequality, environmental degradation, political centralization, made Bronze Age societies more vulnerable over time. External shocks, climate change, military innovations, population movements provided the immediate triggers for collapse. But the real destroyer was the interaction between these factors. The highly interconnected nature of Bronze Age civilization meant that disruption in one area created cascading effects elsewhere. As Centeno's team puts it, the loss of cities driving an economic downturn, trade destabilization, war, piracy, and rebellion. This creates what systems theorists call a cascade failure, where the failure of individual components causes the failure of neighboring components, which in turn fail and cause others to fail until the entire system collapses. It's the same phenomenon that can bring down electrical grids or financial markets, but applied to entire civilizations. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't caused by any single factor, no matter how dramatic. It was caused by the interaction of multiple factors within a system that had become too interconnected and specialized to survive the simultaneous failure of multiple components. 31. The perfect storm theory. Eric Klein's influential perfect storm theory has become the dominant explanation for the Bronze Age collapse among contemporary scholars. Rather than searching for a single cause, whether sea peoples, climate change, or internal rebellion, Klein argues that the collapse resulted from the convergence of multiple crises at the same time. More than the coming of the sea peoples, more than earthquakes, more than drought and climate change, what we see are the results of a perfect storm. Imagine a Bronze Age palace receiving reports of failed harvests due to drought, raids by displaced populations, disrupted trade routes, and internal rebellions, all in the same year. Any one of these crises might have been manageable. 2 or 3 might have strained the system but not broken it. But 4 or 5 major crises simultaneously would overwhelm even the most sophisticated Bronze Age administration. The perfect storm model explains why the collapse was so sudden and complete despite centuries of apparent stability. Bronze Age civilizations had developed impressive capabilities for handling individual crises. They had military forces for defense, grain reserves for famines, diplomatic networks for managing conflicts. But they had no mechanisms for dealing with multiple major crises at once. This theory also explains the regional variation in the collapse. Areas that faced fewer simultaneous crises, like Egypt or Assyria, managed to survive, while regions hit by the full force of the perfect storm, like Mycenaean Greece or the Hittite Empire, collapsed completely. The storm wasn't equally intense everywhere, but where it hit with full force, it was devastating. 32. The trade collapse that wasn't. Jesse Millick's recent analysis has overturned one of the most fundamental assumptions about the Bronze Age collapse, that international trade networks suddenly collapsed around 1200 BCE. His research reveals a far more complex picture, with major trade relationships ending well before the traditional collapse date and others continuing long after. The evidence is striking. Cypriot pottery trade with the Aegean ended around 1300 BCE, 50 years before the supposed collapse. Mycenaean pottery exports to the eastern Mediterranean stopped around 1250 BCE, again decades before 1200. These weren't sudden disruptions caused by sea peoples or climate catastrophe. They were gradual shifts that began during what scholars had considered the height of Bronze Age prosperity. This discovery forces us to reconsider the entire narrative of the collapse. If major trade networks were already failing during the 13th century BCE, then the events around 1200 BCE look less like the sudden collapse of a healthy system and more like the final breakdown of a system that had been in crisis for generations. Millick's work suggests that the Bronze Age economy was more fragile and less resilient than previously believed. Rather than a robust international system suddenly destroyed by external shocks, we see a network already under stress, gradually fragmenting as individual components failed to maintain their connections. This doesn't diminish the significance of the Bronze Age collapse, but it does change how we understand it. The crisis wasn't a sudden catastrophe. It was the culmination of long-term systemic problems that have been building for decades. 33. The persistent metal trade. While pottery exports and luxury goods trade may have collapsed, archaeometallurgical studies reveal that the Bronze Age's most essential commodity, metal, continued to flow across long distances even after 1200 BCE. Tin trade from sources as distant as Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, and possibly Cornwall continued into the Iron Age, while lead from Sardinia was still being imported to the Levant centuries after the supposed collapse. This persistence of metal trade makes sense when we consider how essential these materials were. Bronze required both copper and tin, but tin sources were extremely rare and geographically concentrated. Even during periods of political chaos and economic disruption, someone had to maintain the networks that brought tin from Central Asia to the Eastern Mediterranean. Otherwise, bronze production would have stopped entirely. The continuation of this trade reveals something important about the nature of the Bronze Age collapse. It wasn't a complete breakdown of all economic relationships, but rather a selective collapse that affected different types of exchange differently. Luxury goods and politically controlled trade relationships failed, but economically essential exchanges found ways to continue. This also helps explain how Bronze Age technologies and knowledge survived the collapse in some regions. The craftsmen who knew how to work bronze didn't disappear overnight. They continued practicing their trades, supplied by metal networks that adapted to changed political circumstances. The metal trade's persistence suggests that the Bronze Age collapse, however dramatic in its political and social effects, didn't completely sever all connections between regions. Some threads of the old network survived and would eventually become part of the foundation for Iron Age recovery. 34. The Uluburun Time Capsule. Lying on the seafloor off the coast of Turkey, the Uluburun shipwreck provides an extraordinary snapshot of Bronze Age global trade at its height and reveals just how vulnerable this complex system was to disruption. Dating to around 1320 BCE, the ship and its cargo demonstrate the incredible complexity and reach of late Bronze Age commercial networks. The cargo reads like an inventory of the known world. 10 tons of copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan's mountains, silver and gold from Greece and Egypt, cedar wood from Lebanon's forests, amber from the Baltic, ivory from Africa, and pottery from across the eastern Mediterranean. This single ship was carrying materials from virtually every major Bronze Age civilization. But the Uluburun wreck also reveals the system's vulnerability. This extraordinary diversity of cargo meant the ship's successful voyage depended on stable political conditions, open trade routes, and peaceful relationships across thousands of miles and dozens of different kingdoms. Disruption anywhere along this vast network could make such voyages impossible. The technical knowledge required to organize such expeditions was equally complex. Someone had to know which ports could supply specific materials, what political relationships needed to be maintained, how to finance such enormous undertakings, and how to coordinate timing across vast distances. This knowledge was probably concentrated in a relatively small number of specialized merchants and palace administrators. When the Bronze Age collapse destroyed the political and economic foundations that made such voyages possible, this knowledge largely disappeared with them. The Uluburun shipwreck represents not just Bronze Age prosperity, but Bronze Age vulnerability. 35. Cyprus, the strategic vulnerability. Cyprus occupied a unique and crucial position in the Bronze Age economy as the Mediterranean's primary source of copper, one half of the essential bronze alloy that gave the age its name. This strategic importance made the island's disruption during the collapse particularly devastating for the entire Bronze Age system. The island's copper mines had been supplying the ancient world for over a millennium by 1200 BCE. Egyptian, Hittite, Mycenaean, and Levantine craftsmen all depended on Cypriot copper for their bronze production. The island had become what modern economists would call a critical node in the Bronze Age supply chain, a single point whose failure could disrupt the entire system. Archaeological evidence suggests Cyprus faced repeated attacks during the collapse period. Coastal settlements show signs of destruction, harbors were damaged, and the organized mining operations that had supplied copper across the Mediterranean were disrupted. Even if the attacks weren't completely successful, they were sufficient to interrupt the regular flow of copper that Bronze Age civilizations required. The cascading effects of Cyprus's disruption would have been felt across the ancient world. Bronze production would have slowed or stopped in workshops from Greece to Mesopotamia. Weapons, tools, and luxury goods that required bronze became scarce and expensive. The technological foundation of Bronze Age civilization was literally being undermined. Cyprus's experience during the collapse illustrates how the Bronze Age's greatest strength, economic specialization and efficiency, became its greatest weakness when crisis struck. The same specialization that had made the system so productive made it vulnerable to single points of failure. 36. The Merchant's Tragedy. In the ruins of Ugarit, archaeologists discover the archive of a merchant named Erdenu whose 650 tablets document one of history's most dramatic economic transitions. His correspondence charts the transformation from Bronze Age prosperity to collapse crisis, showing how individual merchants experienced the breakdown of the international system that had sustained their livelihood for generations. Erdenu's early letters follow the familiar patterns of Bronze Age commerce. Routine negotiations over shipments of copper and textiles, discussions of prices and delivery schedules, complaints about competitors and unreliable partners. His network extended across the known world, with regular correspondence reaching Egypt, Assyria, Beirut, and the Hittite realm. But as the collapse approaches, the tone of the letters changes dramatically. Routine trade correspondence gives way to desperate pleas for grain relief as famine spreads across the region. Negotiations over luxury goods are replaced by urgent requests for basic foodstuffs. The language becomes more personal, more emotional, as the formal conventions of commercial correspondence break down under the pressure of genuine crisis. Erdenu's final letters, written as Ugarit itself comes under attack, are heartbreaking in their desperation. This man who had once coordinated trade across continents found himself begging former business partners for the grain that might keep his family alive. His archive ends abruptly, probably when the palace that housed it burned in Ugarit's final destruction. The transformation recorded in Erdenu's letters captures the human cost of the Bronze Age collapse better than any royal inscription or temple relief. 37. The death of writing. One of the most dramatic casualties of the Bronze Age collapse was literacy itself. The Mycenaean Greek Linear B script, a sophisticated writing system that had recorded palace administration for centuries, completely disappeared during the collapse, and writing wouldn't return to Greece for over 400 years. The loss wasn't just technological, it was social and cultural. Linear B literacy had been restricted to a small elite of palace scribes, probably less than 1% of the population. These scribes had undergone years of specialized training in palace schools that maintained the complex knowledge required to read and write the 87 Linear B syllabic signs, plus numerous ideograms. When the palaces burned around 1200 BCE, these scribal schools disappeared with them. The tablets that preserved Linear B text survived only because they were accidentally fired in the conflagrations that destroyed the administrative centers. Without the institutional support of the palaces, the knowledge of how to read and write simply died out. For 4 centuries, Greece had no writing system at all. Oral tradition preserved some cultural memory. The stories that would eventually become Homer's epics probably date to this period, but the detailed administrative, legal, and economic records that had characterized Bronze Age civilization were lost. Writing finally returned to Greece around 800 BCE when the Phoenicians introduced their alphabet, but this represented a completely fresh start rather than a revival of the old system. The Linear B script and the knowledge it contained had vanished as completely as the palaces that had created it. 38. The Accidental Archive. The Linear B tablets that provide our best evidence for Mycenaean civilization exist today only because of a historical accident. These clay documents were never meant to be permanent records. They were temporary administrative notes that palace scribes would normally erase and reuse when the information became outdated. They survived because the palace fires that ended Mycenaean civilization accidentally baked them into pottery hard permanence. Think about the implications. Virtually everything we know about Mycenaean palace administration, economy, and society comes from documents that were preserved by the very catastrophe that destroyed the civilization that created them. It's as if the only records of modern government survived because a nuclear war happened to turn paper documents into stone. The irony runs even deeper. These tablets record the routine business of kingdoms in their final years: tax collections, inventory lists, personnel records, religious offerings. They show Bronze Age administration functioning normally right up until the moment the palaces burned. The scribes who wrote them had no idea they were documenting the last days of their civilization. The preservation process itself tells us something about the intensity of the palace destructions. The fires had to be hot enough and sustained enough to fire clay tablets like pottery in a kiln, but not so intense as to crack or melt them. This suggests systematic burning rather than quick raids, the kind of thorough destruction that leaves nothing salvageable. Without this accidental preservation, our understanding of Mycenaean civilization would be based almost entirely on archaeological artifacts. We would know they existed, but we wouldn't know how they thought, how they organized themselves, or what they considered important. 39. The bronze industry under stress. Archaeological evidence from metallurgical sites across the eastern Mediterranean reveals that bronze production faced severe disruptions during the collapse, though the industry's response was more complex and adaptive than simple shutdown. Sites like Kition in Cyprus show clear evidence of production difficulties, but also reveal attempts to maintain bronze working even under stress conditions. The challenges facing Bronze Age metalworkers were enormous. The tin required for bronze production came from distant sources and required functioning long-distance trade networks. Copper mining required organized labor forces and stable political conditions. The specialized knowledge of bronze-working techniques was concentrated in particular workshops and craft traditions that could be disrupted by population movements or political instability. Yet archaeometallurgical studies indicate that tin trade didn't completely stop after 1200 BCE. Someone, somewhere was maintaining the networks that brought this essential material from Central Asia to Mediterranean workshops. This suggests that even during the collapse, there were people with sufficient resources and knowledge to keep at least part of the bronze production system functioning. The survival of bronze-working knowledge through the collapse period helps explain how these technologies were preserved and eventually passed on to Iron Age civilizations. The craftsmen didn't simply disappear. They adapted to changed circumstances, perhaps working for new patrons or in new locations, but maintaining their technical expertise. This resilience of technological knowledge, even during political and economic collapse, would prove crucial for eventual recovery. The skills that had made Bronze Age civilization possible weren't entirely lost. They went underground and emerged again when conditions allowed. 40. The fragmentation of production. One of the most significant long-term consequences of the Bronze Age collapse was the transformation from palace-controlled craft production to smaller, localized production centers. The sophisticated workshops that had created standardized goods across wide regions fragmented into diverse, household-based manufacturing that would characterize much of the subsequent Iron Age. Bronze Age palaces had maintained what archaeologists call attached specialization. Craftsmen who worked exclusively for palace elites, creating luxury goods, weapons, and standardized products for palace redistribution systems. These workshops could afford to maintain highly specialized workers, expensive raw materials, and sophisticated techniques because they were supported by palace resources. When the palaces fell, this system collapsed with them. Craftsmen who had depended on palace support suddenly found themselves without patrons, materials, or institutional backing. Some probably died in the destructions, others fled as refugees, and still others had to completely reinvent how they practiced their crafts. The archaeological evidence shows the results: a decline in technical sophistication, less standardization across regions, and more variability in product quality. But it also shows adaptation and innovation as craftsmen developed new techniques suited to their changed circumstances. This transformation had profound implications for Bronze Age knowledge preservation. While some sophisticated techniques were lost, others were democratized as former palace craftsmen had to work for broader markets. The collapse had destroyed the elite monopoly on advanced technology, making it more widely available even as overall sophistication declined. 41. The Iron Age begins. The transition to iron technology, which gave the Iron Age its name, wasn't sudden or revolutionary, but rather a gradual process that began during the Bronze Age collapse and continued for centuries afterward. Archaeological evidence shows that iron wasn't used for utilitarian purposes before the Iron Age period, late 12th century BC, becoming truly dominant only during Iron Age, 10th to 9th centuries BC. This timing is significant. Iron technology spread not as the cause of the Bronze Age collapse, but as a consequence of it. When bronze production became difficult due to disrupted tin supplies and collapsed palace workshops, craftsmen increasingly turned to iron as an alternative. Iron's main advantage wasn't superior performance. Early iron tools were often inferior to bronze, but rather availability and independence from long-distance trade networks. Iron ore was much more widely distributed than tin, meaning local communities could potentially become self-sufficient in metal production for the first time. This represented a fundamental shift from the Bronze Age pattern of resource dependence and long-distance exchange toward more localized production systems. The technological knowledge required for iron working was also different. While bronze working required knowledge of alloy proportions and sophisticated casting techniques, iron working required understanding of smelting temperatures and forging methods. These were different skill sets, meaning the transition often involved learning entirely new technological traditions rather than simply adapting old ones. The gradual spread of iron technology thus reflects the broader transformation of the ancient world from the interconnected, specialized Bronze Age system toward the more localized, self-sufficient communities that would characterize much of the early Iron Age. 42. The democratization of technology. Iron's greater abundance, compared to bronze components, had profound social implications that extended far beyond simple technological change. The democratization of metal technology fundamentally altered the balance of power between elites and commoners, making metal tools and weapons accessible to much broader populations than had been possible during the Bronze Age. Bronze production required tin, which came from very few sources and had to be transported across vast distances. This meant that control over bronze technology was necessarily concentrated in the hands of elites who could afford to maintain long-distance trade relationships and specialized workshops. Bronze weapons and tools were luxury items that marked social status as much as serving practical functions. Iron changed this equation completely. Iron ore was available in many regions, and while iron working required higher temperatures, 1,250 degrees Celsius versus 1,085 degrees Celsius for copper, the technology could be mastered by local craftsmen without requiring access to international trade networks. For the first time in human history, metal technology became truly accessible to ordinary communities. The social implications were revolutionary. Farmers could afford metal plows that made agriculture more efficient. Ordinary soldiers could carry iron weapons rather than bronze-tipped spears or clubs. Craftsmen could work with metal tools that made their products better and more competitive. This technological democratization helps explain why many regions recovered relatively quickly from the Bronze Age collapse. While the complex palace systems had disappeared, ordinary communities found themselves with access to better technology than they had ever possessed before. 43. The Great Abandonment. Archaeological surveys across the Bronze Age world reveal the staggering scope of settlement abandonment during the collapse. In the Peloponnese, up to 90% of small sites were abandoned during this period, with entire regions depopulated as their inhabitants fled, died, or migrated to more defensible locations. The pattern is visible from the air. Bronze Age settlement sites that had been continuously occupied for centuries suddenly show no trace of human activity after 1200 BCE. Agricultural terraces that had been carefully maintained for generations were abandoned to erosion. Roads that had connected communities for centuries grew over with vegetation and disappeared. Some areas, like Athens, managed to maintain continuous occupation, but even these survivors showed clear signs of cultural impoverishment that would last for centuries. The sophisticated pottery styles, monumental architecture, and artistic traditions that had characterized Bronze Age civilization largely disappeared, replaced by much simpler material cultures that suggest dramatically reduced populations and economic activity. The demographic impact must have been enormous. While we can't know exact population figures for Bronze Age societies, the archaeological evidence suggests population decline of 75% or more in many regions. This wasn't just political or economic collapse. It was demographic catastrophe on a scale that wouldn't be seen again in the Mediterranean until the Black Death. Recovery would be slow and uneven. Some regions remained sparsely populated for centuries, while others saw new populations move in with different cultural traditions. The Bronze Age landscape of densely settled, intensively cultivated areas connected by regular trade routes had been replaced by a much sparser, more fragmented settlement pattern. 44. The Economic Revolution. The centralized palace economies that had characterized the late Bronze Age represented one of humanity's earliest experiments in complex economic organization, and their complete disintegration during the collapse forced surviving populations to develop entirely new economic arrangements. Archaeological evidence shows the redistributive systems controlled by palaces fragmenting into smaller, household-based economic units. Bronze Age palaces had functioned as economic hubs that collected agricultural surplus from surrounding territories, supported specialized craftsmen, managed long-distance trade, and redistributed goods according to palace priorities. This system could support large populations, monumental construction projects, and sophisticated military forces, but it was also extremely vulnerable to disruption. When the palaces fell, the entire economic framework disappeared with them. There was no longer any institution capable of organizing large-scale economic activity, coordinating between regions, or maintaining the complex relationships that had made Bronze Age prosperity possible. The archaeological evidence shows the results. Much simpler pottery indicating household rather than workshop production, the disappearance of standardized weights and measures, the end of monumental construction projects, and the fragmentation of formerly integrated regions into isolated communities. But this economic simplification also had advantages. Household-based production was more resilient to external shocks. Local communities became more self-sufficient, and economic relationships became more direct and transparent. While overall prosperity declined, economic security may actually have improved for ordinary people who were no longer dependent on palace redistribution systems. 45. Assyria's strategic contraction. While empires collapsed around them, the Middle Assyrian Empire demonstrated that survival was possible through strategic adaptation and institutional resilience. Unlike their neighbors who tried to maintain their expansive commitments even as their resources dwindled, the Assyrians made the hard choice to withdraw to their natural borders while preserving their core strengths. The empire that survived the Bronze Age collapse was different from the one that had existed before it. The Assyrians abandoned their more distant territories and focused on defending their heartland in northern Mesopotamia. They maintained a stable monarchy, the best army in the world, and an efficient civil administration, while allowing their peripheral conquests to slip away. This strategic contraction wasn't easy or painless. It meant abandoning investments, losing tribute income, and accepting reduced international status. But it also meant preserving the institutional knowledge, military traditions, and administrative capabilities that would eventually allow Assyria to rebuild and expand again. The Assyrians also maintained the most consistent written records of any civilization during this period, preserving historical, legal, and administrative knowledge that would prove invaluable for later recovery. While other civilizations were losing their literary traditions, Assyria kept its scribal schools functioning and its archives intact. This institutional continuity explains why Assyria was able to recover so successfully from the Bronze Age collapse. When conditions improved and expansion became possible again, the Assyrians still possessed the knowledge, institutions, and capabilities needed to project power across vast distances. Their temporary contraction had preserved the foundation for future greatness. 46. The Assyrian Phoenix. After the death of Ashur-bal-kala in 1056 BCE, Assyria entered what historians call its contraction period, a deliberate strategic withdrawal that would prove to be one of history's most successful examples of managed decline followed by spectacular recovery. Rather than collapse entirely like so many of their contemporaries, the Assyrians chose to contract their empire while maintaining control over their core territories. This wasn't the desperate flight of a defeated power, but a calculated strategic decision. The Assyrians recognized that the changing conditions of the post-Bronze Age world made their old imperial model unsustainable. Instead of fighting hopeless battles to maintain distant territories, they pulled back to defensible borders and concentrated on keeping their heartland well defended. For several centuries, Assyria virtually disappeared from international affairs. Foreign chronicles that had once recorded Assyrian campaigns and conquests fall silent. The great empire seemed to have joined the ranks of the collapsed Bronze Age powers. But this apparent weakness was actually careful preparation. During their contraction period, the Assyrians maintained their military traditions, preserved their administrative knowledge, and kept their institutional structures intact. When opportunity arose again, they would be ready to expand with unprecedented speed and efficiency. The Neo-Assyrian Empire that emerged from this period would become the largest and most powerful empire the ancient Near East had ever seen, stretching from Iran to Egypt. The strategic contraction that had seemed like defeat in 1056 BCE had actually laid the foundation for Assyria's greatest period of power and influence. 47. Egypt's Pyrrhic victory. Egypt's successful defense against the Sea People's invasions was one of the Bronze Age collapse's few clear military victories, but came at a cost that would permanently alter Egyptian civilization. While Ramesses III could legitimately claim to have saved Egypt from destruction, the victory had drained the resources that had made Egypt a great power in the Bronze Age world. The military campaigns required massive mobilization of Egypt's resources. The entire army had to be equipped and maintained, the navy had to be built up and supplied, fortifications had to be constructed along the frontier. The economic cost of these preparations was enormous, requiring the royal treasury to spend vast sums that had been accumulated over generations of prosperity. More importantly, the campaigns revealed Egypt's vulnerability to future attacks. The fact that foreign invaders had been able to reach Egypt's borders and force major battles showed that the empire's defensive arrangements were inadequate. Future security would require permanent military preparations that would consume resources indefinitely. The aftermath proved even more costly than the campaigns themselves. Egypt's weakened condition led to the Third Intermediate Period, c. 1069 to 525 BCE, characterized by political fragmentation, economic decline, and the loss of international influence. The pharaohs who had once corresponded as equals with the kings of Assyria and Babylonia became regional rulers struggling to maintain control over even their own territories. Egypt had won the war, but lost its empire. The successful defense against the Sea Peoples marked the beginning of Egypt's long decline from great power status, a decline that wouldn't be reversed until the rise of the Ptolemaic dynasty over 6 centuries later. 48. The Phoenician Renaissance. While empires crumbled around them, the Phoenician city-states of the Levantine coast experienced what can only be described as a renaissance during the period traditionally associated with Bronze Age collapse. Between 1230 and 1200 BCE, cities like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos not only survived but maintained political independence, asserted their maritime interests, and enjoyed economic prosperity. The Phoenicians' success lay in their adaptive flexibility and maritime focus. Unlike the land-based empires that depended on controlling large territories and maintaining complex administrative systems, Phoenician power was based on ships, ports, and commercial networks that could adapt quickly to changing political conditions. When the Bronze Age palace economies collapsed, the Phoenicians stepped into the vacuum. They had the ships, the navigational knowledge, and the commercial expertise to maintain trade connections that the failed states could no longer sustain. Their decentralized city-state system meant that the collapse of one center didn't bring down the entire network. Archaeological evidence from Phoenician sites during this period shows continued prosperity, new construction projects, sophisticated craftsmanship, and evidence of expanded trade networks. While Mycenaean pottery disappears from trade routes, Phoenician products begin appearing in new markets across the Mediterranean. The Phoenician Renaissance during the Bronze Age collapse represents one of history's great examples of how crisis can create opportunity for those prepared to adapt. Their success would lay the foundation for Phoenician expansion across the Mediterranean and their role as the ancient world's premier maritime commercial power. 49. The New Maritime Empire. The collapse of Bronze Age palace economies created a commercial vacuum that the Phoenicians were uniquely positioned to fill. During the 10th century BCE, Phoenician merchants re-established long-distance trade between Egypt and Mesopotamia and created a vast mercantile network that would dominate Mediterranean commerce for centuries. This wasn't just a restoration of the old Bronze Age trade networks. It was something entirely new. Phoenician expansion created permanent colonies rather than temporary trading posts. Cyprus, Sardinia, Sicily, Malta, and the coasts of North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula all received Phoenician settlements that would endure for centuries and fundamentally alter the cultural development of the Western Mediterranean. The scale of this expansion was unprecedented. Phoenician colonies stretched from the Strait of Gibraltar to the coast of modern Tunisia, creating the ancient world's first truly global commercial empire. Carthage, originally a Phoenician colony, would eventually become one of Rome's greatest rivals. The Phoenicians succeeded where Bronze Age powers had failed because they adapted their model to post-collapse conditions. Instead of trying to recreate the centralized palace economies that had proven so vulnerable, they developed a decentralized network of autonomous city-states and colonies linked by maritime trade. This new model proved remarkably resilient. Even when individual Phoenician cities were conquered or destroyed, the network as a whole survived and adapted. The commercial and cultural connections established during the Phoenician Renaissance would shape Mediterranean development for over a millennium. 50. The gift of the alphabet. Around 1050 BCE, the Phoenicians developed one of history's most influential innovations, a 22-letter consonantal alphabet that would become the root of the Western alphabets when the Greeks adopted it. This technological breakthrough had implications far beyond simple communication. It democratized literacy and fundamentally altered how knowledge was preserved and transmitted. The Phoenician alphabet was revolutionary because of its simplicity. Earlier writing systems like Linear B or Egyptian hieroglyphics required years of specialized training to master hundreds of different signs. The Phoenician system reduced this complexity to just 22 consonantal letters that could be learned in months rather than years. This simplicity made literacy accessible to much broader populations than had been possible with earlier systems. Merchants, craftsmen, and ordinary citizens could learn to read and write, breaking the monopoly on literacy that had been held by palace scribes and temple priests during the Bronze Age. The Greeks' adoption of the Phoenician alphabet around 800 BCE marked a crucial turning point in Mediterranean cultural development. By adding vowel signs to the Phoenician consonantal system, the Greeks created the first truly complete alphabet, a system so efficient and adaptable that it became the foundation for virtually all Western writing systems. The Phoenician alphabet thus represents one of the Bronze Age collapse's most positive legacies. While the collapse had destroyed the complex scribal traditions of the palace economies, it had also created conditions for the development of simpler, more democratic forms of literacy that would prove far more durable and influential. 51. The Hittite survivors. The collapse of the Hittite Empire wasn't the end of Hittite civilization. It was a transformation that saw remnants of the empire survive in new forms across Anatolia and northern Syria. The viceroyalty of Tarhuntassa in southern Anatolia and the kingdom of Carchemish in Syria both maintained uninterrupted continuity with the old empire, preserving Hittite royal traditions, religious practices, and cultural identity. Carchemish is particularly significant because it was headed by a side branch of the Hittite royal family that could trace its lineage directly back to the great kings of Hattusa. When the imperial capital was abandoned, Carchemish became the keeper of Hittite legitimacy, maintaining the fiction that the empire continued even as its political reality had disappeared. Archaeological evidence from these Neo-Hittite centers reveals remarkable cultural continuity. The same artistic styles, architectural traditions, and religious practices that had characterized the empire continued in these reduced circumstances. Royal inscriptions continued to be carved in Luwian hieroglyphs using formulas and titles that dated back to the imperial period. But these successor states also showed adaptation to changed circumstances. They were smaller, more flexible, and more responsive to local conditions than the old empire had been. They successfully integrated with local populations while maintaining their Hittite identity, creating hybrid cultures that combined imperial traditions with regional innovations. The survival of these Neo-Hittite states proves that the Bronze Age collapse, however dramatic, didn't completely erase the civilizations it affected. Elements of the old order persisted, adapted, and eventually contributed to the cultural foundations of the Iron Age world. 52. Cultural continuity in crisis. The Neo-Hittite states that emerged from the collapse of the Hittite Empire, c. 1200 to 700 BCE, demonstrated one of history's most remarkable examples of cultural continuity surviving political catastrophe. Despite the complete breakdown of imperial administration, Luwian hieroglyphs continuing almost uninterrupted from the 13th century Hittite imperial monuments, while successfully incorporating indigenous Syrian peoples and, increasingly, Aramean groups. This cultural persistence is visible in everything from monumental sculpture to religious practices. Neo-Hittite kings continued to commission royal inscriptions in the same style and format as their imperial predecessors. Religious ceremonies maintained the same ritual formulas and architectural settings. Even artistic conventions showed direct continuity with imperial Hittite traditions. But this wasn't mere conservatism, it was creative adaptation. Neo-Hittite culture successfully integrated new influences while maintaining its core identity. Aramean populations brought new linguistic and cultural elements that were absorbed into Hittite traditions without destroying them. Local Syrian practices were incorporated into Hittite religious and political systems. The result was a series of hybrid cultures that were recognizably Hittite, but also distinctly adapted to post-collapse conditions. These societies proved more flexible and resilient than their imperial predecessor, successfully navigating the changed political landscape of the early Iron Age while preserving essential elements of their heritage. This cultural continuity had profound implications for the preservation of Bronze Age knowledge and traditions. Through the Neo-Hittite states, important elements of Hittite law, religion, literature, and technology survived the collapse and continued to influence regional development for centuries. 53. Cyprus, Island of Resilience. While mainland civilizations collapsed around them, Cyprus demonstrated remarkable resilience that challenges traditional narratives about the Bronze Age collapse. Archaeological evidence reveals that several areas of Cyprus, Kition and Paphos, appear to have flourished after 1200 BC during the LCIA, rather than experiencing any sort of downturn, with major coastal sites not only surviving, but perhaps becoming new centers of authority. This Cypriot success story is particularly significant given the island's crucial role in Bronze Age economics as the primary source of copper for bronze production. The disruption of Cypriot copper supplies should have been devastating for the entire Bronze Age system. Yet the archaeological evidence suggests the island adapted successfully to changing conditions. The excavations at Kition are particularly revealing. Vassos Karageorgis, the site's primary excavator, explicitly stated that there is no evidence of violent destruction. On the contrary, we observe a cultural continuity. Rather than the dramatic destruction scenarios found at many mainland sites, Cyprus shows gradual adaptation and continued prosperity. Cyprus's resilience probably reflected several advantages. Its island location provided natural protection from land-based military threats. Its maritime orientation made it less dependent on mainland political stability, and its essential role in copper production gave it continued economic value even during periods of political chaos. The island's success also helped preserve important Bronze Age traditions and technologies that might otherwise have been lost. Cypriot craftsmen maintained their metallurgical expertise, artistic traditions, and commercial networks throughout the collapse period, providing continuity that would prove valuable for later recovery. 54. The Iron Revolution from Cyprus. Cyprus's response to the Bronze Age collapse reveals one of history's most successful examples of technological adaptation under pressure. As traditional bronze production faced disruption, the island's craftsmen successfully pivoted from being the masters of copper to suddenly being the masters of this new iron technology, maintaining Cyprus's position as a major Mediterranean technological center. This transition wasn't just a matter of switching materials. It required completely different technical knowledge. Ironworking demanded higher temperatures, different fuel sources, new tools, and entirely different approaches to metalworking. The fact that Cypriot craftsmen mastered these techniques so quickly suggests both exceptional skill and access to knowledge that may have come from elsewhere. Cyprus's early adoption of iron technology gave the island a significant competitive advantage during the transition period. While other regions struggled with disrupted bronze supplies, Cyprus could offer iron tools and weapons that were often superior to bronze and certainly more readily available. The island's success with iron technology also helped maintain its position as a crucial node in Mediterranean trade networks. Instead of becoming isolated by the collapse of Bronze Age commercial systems, Cyprus adapted its products to meet the needs of emerging Iron Age markets. Archaeological evidence suggests that Cypriot ironworking techniques spread throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, contributing to the broader technological transformation that characterized the transition from Bronze to Iron Age. Cyprus had successfully transformed itself from the center of an old technology to the leader of a new one. 55. The geography of collapse. One of the most striking aspects of the Bronze Age collapse is how unequally it affected different regions, creating a geographic pattern that reveals important insights about what made some areas more vulnerable than others. While the Peloponnese suffered catastrophic population decline and cultural breakdown, coastal Cyprus and the Assyrian heartland experienced minimal direct destruction and maintained much of their institutional and cultural continuity. This regional variation directly influenced recovery patterns in ways that would shape the ancient world for centuries. Areas that maintained population, institutional knowledge, and economic activity during the collapse were positioned to take advantage of improving conditions much more quickly than regions that had been completely disrupted. The geographic factors that influence collapse vulnerability seem to have included access to natural defenses, diversified resource bases, maritime versus terrestrial orientation, and the degree of dependence on palace-based administrative systems. Islands and mountainous regions generally fared better than open plains, while areas with access to multiple resource sources proved more resilient than those dependent on single commodities. Political geography also mattered enormously. Regions that were heavily integrated into the palace-based Bronze Age system, like Mycenaean Greece or the Hittite Empire's core territories, proved more vulnerable than areas with more decentralized political arrangements. Understanding this geographic pattern helps explain why recovery was so uneven and why some regions would dominate the early Iron Age while others remained marginal for centuries. The Bronze Age collapse didn't create a level playing field. It amplified existing geographic advantages and disadvantages. 56. The timeline of recovery. The recovery from the Bronze Age collapse followed dramatically different timelines across the Eastern Mediterranean, creating patterns of regional development that would shape the ancient world for centuries. While Greece entered what scholars call a Dark Age, lasting roughly 400 years c. 1100 to 750 BC, Phoenician cities began their renaissance almost immediately, and Cyprus showed continuous prosperity throughout the period traditionally associated with collapse. These different recovery patterns had profound implications for political and cultural development. Regions that recovered quickly were able to establish dominant positions in Iron Age trade networks, expand into territories left vacant by slower recovering areas, and preserve greater continuity with Bronze Age traditions and knowledge. The Greek Dark Age represents one extreme of the collapse experience. Archaeological evidence suggests population decline of 90% or more in some areas, complete loss of literacy, dramatic simplification of material culture, and isolation from international networks that had connected Greece to the wider ancient world for centuries. At the other extreme, the Phoenician Renaissance saw these maritime city-states expanding their influence and establishing new colonies across the Mediterranean, even as traditional Bronze Age powers were struggling to survive. Their rapid recovery allowed them to become the dominant commercial power of the early Iron Age. Understanding these different recovery timelines helps explain why the post-collapse world looked so different from what had come before. The Bronze Age collapse hadn't just destroyed the old order. It had created opportunities for previously marginal powers to establish new forms of dominance. 57. The destruction that wasn't. Recent archaeological reassessment has revealed that many sites traditionally considered victims of Bronze Age destruction actually show no evidence of violent collapse. Cities like Hama, Katna, Kadesh, Alalak, and Aleppo remained intact through the collapse period, indicating the destruction was far more selective than traditional narrative suggested. This discovery has profound implications for how we understand the nature of the Bronze Age collapse. Rather than a wave of universal destruction sweeping across the ancient world, we see a pattern of selective collapse that affected some centers while leaving others largely untouched. The sites that survived tend to share certain characteristics. They were often located away from major palace centers, had more diversified economies, or occupied strategic positions that made them valuable to whoever controlled them. This suggests that the collapse was more politically and economically targeted than previously believed. The survival of these sites also helps explain how Bronze Age knowledge and traditions were preserved through the collapse period. These continuing centers served as repositories of cultural memory, technological knowledge, and institutional practices that would prove valuable for later recovery. The pattern of selective destruction also suggests that the Bronze Age collapse was more about the failure of specific political and economic systems than about wholesale civilizational breakdown. The palace-based redistributive economies collapsed, but many smaller communities and regional centers adapted successfully to change conditions. 58. Cyprus defies the narrative. The archaeological evidence from Cyprus during the traditional Bronze Age collapse period challenges fundamental assumptions about this pivotal era in ancient history. Contrary to narratives of widespread destruction and abandonment, Cyprus experienced far less destruction than previously believed, with sites like Kition showing clear cultural continuity, rather than the violent breakdown documented at many mainland locations. This Cypriot exceptionalism is particularly significant because the island had been so integral to Bronze Age civilization as the primary source of copper for bronze production. If the collapse had been as universal and devastating as traditionally portrayed, Cyprus should have been among the most severely affected regions. Instead, archaeological excavations reveal a different story. Major coastal settlements continued to function, trade networks adapted rather than disappeared, and cultural traditions showed remarkable continuity. The island's inhabitants seem to have successfully navigated the transition from Bronze Age to Iron Age without experiencing the dramatic disruption that characterized many mainland regions. The excavations at Kition are particularly telling. Site director Vassos Karageorgis' explicit statement that there is no evidence of violent destruction. On the contrary, we observe a cultural continuity directly contradicts traditional collapse narratives that assumed universal destruction. Cyprus's successful adaptation during this period helped preserve important Bronze Age technologies, artistic traditions, and commercial practices that might otherwise have been lost. The island served as a bridge between the Bronze Age and Iron Age worlds, maintaining continuity while adapting to changed circumstances. 59. Palatial versus urban destruction. Recent archaeological analysis reveals that Bronze Age collapse destruction was concentrated at palatial centers rather than representing widespread urban destruction, fundamentally altering our understanding of what actually collapsed during this period. Many alleged destructions were based on false assumptions, inadequate evidence, or dating errors rather than clear archaeological proof of violent collapse. This pattern makes sense when we consider the nature of Bronze Age political organization. The palace centers were the nodes that controlled trade networks, maintained administrative systems, and coordinated military forces. They were also the most visible symbols of Bronze Age power and the most likely targets for anyone seeking to overthrow the existing order. The concentration of destruction at palatial sites suggests that the Bronze Age collapse was primarily a political phenomenon. The breakdown of the palace-based redistributive systems that had characterized late Bronze Age civilization. The palaces fell, but many of the communities they had controlled continued to exist, albeit under changed circumstances. This selective pattern of destruction also helps explain why recovery was possible. While the complex administrative and economic systems of the Bronze Age had been destroyed, much of the underlying population, technological knowledge, and cultural tradition survived. The collapse had removed the superstructure of Bronze Age civilization without completely destroying its foundations. Understanding this pattern also reveals the limitations of archaeological evidence. Palace sites are more likely to be excavated than ordinary settlements, meaning our evidence may be biased toward documenting the destruction of elite centers while missing the continuity of everyday life. 60. The Great Reassessment. Jesse Millick's comprehensive 2023 analysis represents a watershed moment in Bronze Age collapse studies, fundamentally challenging the empirical foundation upon which decades of scholarship have been built. His systematic examination of 148 sites with 153 alleged destruction events revealed that 94 instances, representing 61% of the supposed evidence, were either misdated based on insufficient evidence or had never actually occurred. This isn't just an academic correction. It's a complete rewriting of one of archaeology's most influential narratives. For over a century, the Bronze Age collapse had been understood as a period of universal destruction and cultural breakdown. Millick's work reveals that this understanding was based largely on assumptions and scholarly tradition rather than rigorous archaeological evidence. The methodology behind this reassessment is as important as its conclusions. Millick didn't simply accept published claims about Bronze Age destructions. He tracked down original excavation reports, examined the actual evidence, and applied consistent standards for what constitutes proof of violent destruction. This kind of systematic reevaluation is rare in archaeology, but essential for maintaining scientific credibility. The implications extend far beyond Bronze Age studies. Millick's work demonstrates how archaeological narratives can become self-reinforcing, with each generation of scholars accepting and building upon conclusions that may not have been adequately supported by evidence. His reassessment calls for more rigorous standards in evaluating archaeological claims. The Bronze Age collapse remains a real and significant phenomenon, but Millick's work shows it was more complex, more regionally variable, and more selective than previously believed. 61. The Druze Deconstruction. Robert Drew's influential 1993 study, The End of the Bronze Age, featured 60 sites that he argued had been destroyed during the Bronze Age collapse, providing much of the empirical foundation for modern understanding of this period. However, subsequent archaeological analysis has revealed that 31 of these sites, 52% of Drew's examples, were actually false destructions, including major centers like Athens, Knossos, Carchemish, and Aleppo. This discovery is particularly significant because Drew's work has been enormously influential in shaping scholarly and popular understanding of the Bronze Age collapse. His book provided what seemed to be comprehensive archaeological evidence for widespread destruction, supporting theories about Sea Peoples' invasions and civilizational breakdown. The fact that over half of Drew's featured destructions were false highlights a broader problem in Bronze Age archaeology. the tendency to assume destruction when evidence is ambiguous, to attribute all destructions to the same period, and to accept earlier scholarly claims without sufficient verification. The sites that Drews incorrectly included as destruction victims represent a who's who of Bronze Age civilization. Athens, far from being destroyed, maintained continuous occupation throughout the collapse period. Knossos shows no evidence of destruction around 1200 BCE. Carchemish actually became the capital of a Neo-Hittite kingdom that preserved Hittite traditions for centuries. This pattern of false destructions suggests that the Bronze Age collapse narrative had become so influential that evidence was unconsciously interpreted to fit expectations rather than being evaluated on its own merits. Drew's work, while pioneering in many ways, exemplifies how compelling theories can shape the interpretation of archaeological evidence. 62. The scientific revolution in dating. Modern Bronze Age collapse chronology represents a complete transformation from earlier approaches, moving away from historical synchronisms and ancient king lists towards scientific dating methods that provide unprecedented precision and reliability. Radiocarbon dating, ceramic analysis, and stratigraphic excavation, enhanced by Bayesian statistical analysis, have created chronological frameworks that are accurate to within decades rather than centuries. This scientific revolution has fundamentally altered our understanding of when and how the Bronze Age collapse unfolded. Earlier chronologies, based on correlating Egyptian records with Mesopotamian king lists and Greek legends, often had margins of error spanning centuries and depended on assumptions about the reliability of ancient sources. Radiocarbon dating, particularly when combined with accelerator mass spectrometry (AMS) techniques, can now provide dates with standard deviations of just a few decades. When multiple radiocarbon dates are combined with Bayesian statistical analysis, the resulting chronologies achieve remarkable precision. Ceramic analysis has also become increasingly sophisticated, with specialists able to identify pottery styles that changed over periods of just a few decades. When found in stratigraphic association with radiocarbon-dated materials, these ceramics provide independent confirmation of chronological sequences. Perhaps most importantly, modern excavation techniques emphasize understanding site formation processes, how archaeological deposits actually formed and what they represent. This understanding allows archaeologists to distinguish between destruction events and later disturbances, between contemporary deposits and mixed contexts. The result is a chronological framework for the Bronze Age collapse that is more precise, more reliable, and more complex than anything previously available. 63. The systems collapse consensus. Contemporary academic consensus, led by scholars like Eric Klein, has moved away from simple monocausal explanations towards systems collapse models that emphasize how multiple interconnected factors created cascading failures throughout Bronze Age civilization. This approach recognizes that complex societies are vulnerable to what systems theorists call cascade failures, situations where the failure of individual components causes neighboring components to fail, ultimately bringing down entire networks. The systems collapse model explains several puzzling aspects of the Bronze Age collapse that single-cause theories couldn't address. Why did the collapse affect such a wide geographic area? Because Bronze Age civilizations were interconnected through trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Why was the collapse so rapid once it began? Because the same interconnectedness that had been a source of strength became a vulnerability when multiple stresses hit simultaneously. Current scholarship identifies several categories of stress that combine to create the perfect storm. Environmental pressures, drought, climate change, military innovations, new weapons and tactics, internal instability, rebellions, succession crises, and economic disruption, trade route failures, resource scarcities. No single factor was sufficient to cause collapse, but their interaction created system-wide failure. This model also explains the regional variation in collapse patterns. Areas that faced fewer simultaneous stresses or had more resilient institutions managed to survive, while regions hit by multiple crises simultaneously experienced complete breakdown. The systems collapse approach represents a mature understanding of how complex societies function and fail, drawing on insights from ecology, economics, and complexity theory to create more sophisticated explanations than earlier single-cause theories could provide. 64. From catastrophe to transition. Recent scholarship has fundamentally reframed the Bronze Age collapse, moving away from viewing it as a sudden, apocalyptic event towards seeing it as a more protracted transition with limited scale and scope. A. Bernard Knapp and Stuart W. Manning's influential observation that the collapse was more limited in scale and scope than previously thought reflects a broader scholarly consensus that emphasizes gradual transformation rather than catastrophic breakdown. This reframing has profound implications for how we understand both the Bronze Age and its aftermath. Rather than a dramatic end to civilization followed by a dark age, we see a complex transition where some elements of Bronze Age culture disappeared while others adapted and evolved into new forms. The transition model helps explain apparent contradictions in the archaeological record. Why some sites show clear destruction while others show continuity, why some technologies disappeared while others persisted, why some regions experienced demographic collapse while others maintained stable populations. This approach also emphasizes human agency and adaptation rather than passive victimhood. Bronze Age peoples weren't simply overwhelmed by forces beyond their control. They made choices about how to respond to changing circumstances, some more successfully than others. The transition model has also influenced how scholars think about periodization itself. Rather than sharp breaks between Bronze Age and Iron Age, we see gradual changes in technology, social organization, and cultural practice that unfolded over centuries rather than decades. This more nuanced understanding makes the Bronze Age collapse less dramatic, but perhaps more instructive for understanding how complex societies respond to stress and change. 65. The continuing debate. Contemporary Bronze Age collapse scholarship continues to evolve as new discoveries, advanced dating techniques, and theoretical innovations refine our understanding of this pivotal period. Major debates center on fundamental questions about the extent of destruction, the role of climate change, the identity and significance of the Sea Peoples, and the relationship between environmental stress and social collapse. The extent of destruction remains contentious despite Jesse Millick's reassessment. While clearly less universal than once believed, scholars debate whether the reduced number of confirmed destructions represents a real pattern or simply reflects incomplete archaeological evidence. Some regions may have experienced more destruction than current evidence suggests. Climate change's role continues to generate intense discussion. While most scholars accept that environmental stress contributed to the collapse, they disagree about whether climate change was a primary cause, a triggering factor, or simply one stress among many. The relationship between environmental change and social response remains complex and debated. The Sea Peoples' identity question persists despite decades of research. Some scholars continue to see them as external invaders who triggered the collapse, while others view them as symptoms of breakdown rather than causes. New archaeological discoveries occasionally provide fresh evidence, but the fundamental questions remain unresolved. Perhaps most importantly, scholars continue to refine theoretical frameworks for understanding societal collapse. Insights from complexity theory, resilience studies, and environmental archaeology are creating more sophisticated models for analyzing how and why complex societies fail or adapt successfully. This ongoing scholarly debate reflects the Bronze Age collapse's continued relevance for understanding broader questions about civilization, sustainability, and social change. 66. Voices from the Last Days. The Ugarit archives preserve approximately 650 cuneiform tablets that document one of history's most dramatic transitions from prosperity to catastrophe. These tablets, written in multiple languages including Ugaritic, Akkadian, Hittite, Hurrian, and Cyprominoan, reveal the extraordinary international connections that made Ugarit a crucial hub in the Bronze Age world and provide heartbreaking glimpses into its final moments. The archive contains routine diplomatic correspondence between kings, detailed trade agreements spanning continents, religious texts that illuminate Bronze Age spiritual beliefs, and legal documents covering everything from marriage contracts to slave transactions. But it's the final letters that truly capture the human drama of the collapse. King Amurapi's desperate correspondence stands as one of archaeology's most poignant documents. His plea, "Send me forces and chariots, and may my lord save me from the forces of this enemy," strips away all diplomatic formality to reveal raw human terror. These aren't the measured words of royal correspondence, but the desperate cries of a man watching his world burn. The archive ends abruptly, the tablets scattered where they fell when the palace burned around 1200 BCE. The international hub that had connected civilizations for centuries was silenced forever, its 650 tablets serving as an accidental time capsule of Bronze Age civilization's final breath. 67. Egyptian propaganda and historical truth. The primary sources for understanding the Sea Peoples come from Egyptian temple inscriptions at Medinet Habu and Karnak, magnificent reliefs commissioned by Ramesses III to commemorate his victories over these mysterious invaders. However, modern scholars have learned to read these sources with considerable skepticism, recognizing them as sophisticated royal propaganda rather than objective historical records. These temple reliefs follow well-established Egyptian artistic and literary conventions designed to glorify pharaonic power and intimidate both domestic and foreign audiences. The dramatic sea battles, the masses of enemy captives, the pharaoh's supernatural strength in combat, all of these elements appear repeatedly in Egyptian royal art regardless of the specific historical circumstances being commemorated. The challenge for modern historians is separating historical fact from propagandistic embellishment. The reliefs certainly record real events. Egypt did face serious military threats from seaborne invaders, but the details may reflect Egyptian artistic conventions as much as historical reality. Most tellingly, the Egyptian sources show us the Sea Peoples entirely through Egyptian eyes, with no voice given to the invaders themselves. We see them as Egypt's enemies wanted them to be seen, as chaotic, foreign, threatening forces that only Egyptian military might could defeat. Understanding these sources as propaganda, rather than history, helps explain why the Sea Peoples remain so mysterious. We're seeing them through the lens of the one power that successfully resisted them. 68. The archaeology of famine. Hittite texts from the empire's final period provide devastating evidence of widespread famine and food shortages that reveal the environmental crisis underlying political collapse. These administrative documents and royal correspondence chart the empire's desperate struggle against ecological catastrophe that its sophisticated bureaucracy ultimately couldn't overcome. Letters from the Hittite queen reveal the personal dimension of imperial crisis, as she personally requests grain supplies from foreign allies. The fact that the royal family itself was involved in seeking food aid suggests the severity of the shortages and the breakdown of normal administrative channels. Perhaps most significantly, Egyptian records from Pharaoh Merneptah's reign mention food aid sent to the Hittites, an extraordinary reversal of normal diplomatic relations. For the proud Hittite Empire to accept charity from Egypt reveals desperation that must have been visible to the entire ancient world. Contemporary texts describe the crisis using the Akkadian term Bairu, which implies not just food shortage, but genuine starvation threatening entire populations. Officials write of empty granaries, failed harvests, and populations abandoning their traditional territories in search of sustenance. These documents provide crucial evidence that the Bronze Age collapse wasn't simply political or military, but fundamentally environmental. The sophisticated administrative systems that had governed complex societies for centuries were breaking down under ecological pressures they had no technology to address. 69. The Diplomatic Revolution. The 14th century BCE Amarna letters provide crucial context for understanding how the Bronze Age collapse destroyed one of history's most sophisticated diplomatic systems. These 382 cuneiform tablets, discovered in Egypt in 1887, document the club of great powers that had maintained international relations between Egypt, Assyria, Babylonia, the Hittite Empire, and Mitanni for over a century. This diplomatic system was remarkable for its sophistication and stability. Kings addressed each other as brothers, exchanged gifts and wives, coordinated military campaigns, and maintained regular correspondence about everything from trade disputes to succession crises. The Amarna letters reveal a level of international cooperation and cultural exchange that wouldn't be seen again for centuries. The system's complexity also made it vulnerable to cascade failures. Each kingdom's stability depended partly on maintaining relationships with the others. Trade agreements, military alliances, and diplomatic marriages created an interconnected web where problems in one kingdom could destabilize relationships throughout the system. When multiple members of this club began facing internal crises simultaneously, environmental stress, military pressure, economic disruption, the entire diplomatic framework started to collapse. Partners who had once provided mutual support were no longer able to help each other, creating a downward spiral that accelerated the breakdown. The Amarna letters thus document not just Bronze Age diplomatic achievement, but also the vulnerability of complex international systems to systemic failure. 70. The Hittite Archives' Silent Testimony. The approximately 30,000 cuneiform tablets discovered in the Hattusa archives provide an unparalleled window into the administrative complexity of Bronze Age imperial government and reveal crucial evidence about how the Hittite Empire ended. Rather than documenting sudden military defeat or catastrophic destruction, these tablets suggest systematic abandonment and careful preparation for the capital's evacuation. The Hittite Imperial Archives represent one of the ancient world's most sophisticated bureaucratic systems. Tablets document everything from international treaties and military campaigns to detailed records of personnel, resources, and religious ceremonies. The scope and organization of this archive system reveals an empire capable of coordinating activities across vast distances with remarkable efficiency. But it's what's missing from the archives that tells the most important story. Evidence suggests that valuable materials were systematically removed before the capital's final abandonment. Important documents were taken away, precious objects were evacuated, and the archives themselves were organized as if for permanent closure rather than temporary absence. This pattern suggests that the Hittite collapse wasn't a sudden catastrophe, but a managed retreat in the face of insurmountable pressures. Imperial officials had time to prepare, to salvage what could be saved, and to organize the abandonment of their capital city. The Hittite archives thus document not just imperial administration, but imperial death, the careful dissolution of a complex state system that recognized its own unsustainability. 71. The Knossos dating controversy. The dating of the Knossos Linear B archive reveals how archaeological interpretation can evolve as new evidence emerges and old assumptions are challenged. Arthur Evans originally dated these crucial tablets to 1400 BCE, but comparison with Carl Blegen's discoveries at Pylos forced a fundamental reconsideration that illuminates the interconnected nature of Mycenaean palace civilization. Evans' early dating was based on the stratigraphic context in which he found the tablets and his understanding of Minoan-Mycenaean cultural relationships. However, when Blegen discovered Linear B tablets at Pylos that were clearly destroyed around 1200 BCE, specialists noticed that both archives contained identical stirrup jar types and similar administrative terminology. This discovery suggested that the Knossos and Pylos archives were roughly contemporary rather than separated by 2 centuries. If the palaces were using identical pottery styles and administrative systems, they were probably functioning during the same period rather than representing different phases of Mycenaean development. Current scholarship dates the final Knossos Linear B archive to the 13th century BCE, making it contemporary with the other Mycenaean palace archives. This redating has profound implications for understanding the scope and timing of the Bronze Age collapse. The Knossos controversy illustrates how archaeological dating depends on understanding relationships between sites rather than just individual stratigraphy. It also shows how new discoveries can force reinterpretation of older excavations. 72. The mystery of Ugarit's missing dead. One of the most puzzling aspects of Ugarit's destruction is what archaeologists didn't find. Apart from properly interred burials, no human remains or skeletons were discovered in the destruction layers, suggesting the population somehow evacuated before the catastrophe that would destroy their city forever. This absence is particularly significant given the scale and intensity of Ugarit's destruction. The 6,500 square meter royal palace complex was completely destroyed, the city's residential areas were burned, and the entire urban infrastructure was systematically demolished. Such thorough destruction would normally be expected to trap at least some inhabitants who couldn't escape in time. The evidence suggests that Ugarit's population had advance warning of the approaching threat and time to organize an evacuation. This raises important questions about the nature of the forces that destroyed the city. Were they so well known and predictable that the inhabitants could prepare for their arrival? Was there a siege that gave people time to flee? Archaeological evidence shows that the destruction included both earthquake damage and fire, suggesting either multiple disasters or a complex sequence of events. The earthquake damage might have prompted initial evacuation, with the fire coming later as a separate event. The missing bodies at Ugarit stand in stark contrast to other Bronze Age destruction sites, where human remains are found in destruction contexts, suggesting that different sites experienced different types of crisis and had different opportunities for escape. 73. Religious transformation in crisis. Archaeological evidence from Cyprus during the late Bronze Age reveals fundamental changes in religious practice that reflect broader social transformations accompanying the Bronze Age collapse. The island's ritual practices shifted from elaborate palace-centered ceremonies to simpler, more localized forms of worship that would characterize much of the subsequent Iron Age. Bronze Age palace religion had been highly centralized, with major ceremonies conducted in palace sanctuaries by specialized priests serving royal patrons. These rituals often involved expensive offerings, complex ceremonial equipment, and elaborate architectural settings that demonstrated both divine favor and royal power. The archaeological evidence for this transformation comes from changes in sanctuary architecture, ritual deposits, and religious artifacts. Palace sanctuaries were abandoned or simplified, while smaller, community-based shrines became more common. Expensive ritual equipment disappeared, replaced by simpler offerings that ordinary communities could afford. This religious transformation reflects broader social changes accompanying political collapse. Without palace patronage, religious communities had to develop more sustainable, less resource-intensive forms of worship. The result was often more democratic and participatory religion that better reflected local needs and capabilities. The changes in Cypriot religious practice illustrate how the Bronze Age collapse affected not just political and economic structures, but also the spiritual and cultural foundations of ancient societies. The transformation of religious practice both reflected and contributed to broader social reorganization. 74. Death and social revolution. Archaeological evidence from Bronze Age Greece reveals dramatic changes in burial practices that reflect fundamental social reorganization accompanying the collapse. The elaborate tholos tombs of the Mycenaean elite were abandoned in favor of simpler burial practices that suggest both demographic decline and social leveling. Mycenaean tholos tombs were architectural marvels. Massive stone structures requiring enormous labor investment and sophisticated engineering knowledge. They serve not just as burial places, but as monuments to elite power, visible symbols of social hierarchy that could be seen across the landscape. The abandonment of these burial traditions wasn't gradual, it was sudden and complete. After 1200 BCE, no new tholos tombs were constructed, and even existing ones often stopped receiving new burials. This represents a complete break with centuries of elite burial tradition. The new burial practices that emerged were dramatically simpler. Individual graves, modest grave goods, and burial locations that weren't marked by monumental architecture. This suggests not just reduced wealth, but fundamental changes in social organization and ideology. These changes in burial practice provide crucial evidence for understanding the social impact of the Bronze Age collapse. The disappearance of elite burial traditions suggests that the collapse affected not just political structures, but also the social hierarchies and cultural values that had defined Bronze Age civilization. 75. The end of palace civilization. The complete disappearance of Mycenaean palaces represents one of the Bronze Age collapse's most dramatic transformations. Archaeological evidence from Pylos, Mycenae, and Tiryns shows that these complex architectural and administrative centers were not just damaged, but completely destroyed, never to be rebuilt to the same scale or complexity for centuries. Mycenaean palaces were more than just royal residences. They were the administrative, economic, and cultural centers that defined Bronze Age Greek civilization. These complexes included royal apartments, administrative offices, storage facilities, workshops, religious shrines, and archives that coordinated activities across wide territories. The destruction was so complete that in many cases archaeologists have difficulty reconstructing palace layouts because so little survived above foundation level. At Pylos, only the Linear B tablets survived because they were accidentally fired in the destruction. At Mycenae, successive destructions left only scattered architectural fragments. More significantly, these palaces were never rebuilt to their former complexity. While some sites saw later occupation, the sophisticated multi-functional complexes that had characterized Mycenaean civilization simply disappeared from the Greek landscape. The end of palace civilization marked the end of the centralized administrative systems that had made Mycenaean society possible. Without these administrative centers, the complex economic, military, and cultural networks they had coordinated simply dissolved. 76. The Military Revolution Theory. Robert Drew's influential 1993 analysis proposed that military technological change played a crucial role in the Bronze Age collapse. With the emergence of massed infantry, using newly developed weapons and armor, such as cast rather than forged spearheads, and long swords and javelins, creating tactical advantages that could swarm and cut down a chariot army. This military revolution theory suggests that Bronze Age armies, organized around expensive chariot forces and heavily armored elite warriors, became vulnerable to new tactics that emphasized mass infantry armed with cheaper but effective weapons. The democratization of military technology would have shifted power away from traditional elites toward broader populations. Archaeological evidence supports some aspects of this theory. New weapon types do appear during the collapse period, including longer swords, improved spearheads, and new varieties of defensive armor. These innovations often required less specialized metallurgy and could be produced more cheaply than traditional Bronze Age weapons. The tactical implications would have been profound. Chariot armies required extensive training, expensive equipment, and sophisticated logistical support. Infantry armies could be raised more quickly from broader populations and equipped with less expensive weapons and armor. However, the military revolution theory faces challenges from chronological evidence, suggesting that many of these innovations appeared after rather than before the major palace destructions. The new military technology may have been a response to the collapse rather than its cause. 77. Iron's disputed role. The relationship between iron technology and the Bronze Age collapse remains one of the most debated questions in ancient history, with scholars disagreeing about whether iron's spread caused the collapse, resulted from it, or was largely coincidental. Leonard Palmer's suggestion that iron's superiority allowed larger armies of iron users to overwhelm the smaller bronze-equipped armies represents one pole of this debate. Iron technology did begin spreading during the collapse period, but recent research indicates this spread was too slow and geographically limited to be the primary cause of such widespread destruction. Early iron tools were often inferior to bronze equivalents and required different technological knowledge that took time to develop. The timing evidence is particularly problematic for theories of iron-driven collapse. Iron technology was known in some regions before the collapse began, but it didn't become dominant until centuries after the major destructions had occurred. This suggests iron spread in response to bronze production difficulties rather than causing them. However, iron's eventual dominance did have profound implications for post-collapse recovery. Iron ore was much more widely distributed than tin, meaning communities could potentially become self-sufficient in metal production for the first time. This reduced dependence on long-distance trade networks that had been disrupted by the collapse. The iron debate illustrates broader questions about the relationship between technological change and social transformation. Did new technology drive social change, or did social change create demand for new technology? 78. The interconnected vulnerability. The highly interconnected nature of late Bronze Age civilizations created what systems theorists recognize as a classic vulnerability to cascade failures. Situations where the failure of individual components causes neighboring components to fail until entire networks collapse. The rise of infantry warfare represents just one element in this broader pattern of systemic breakdown. Bronze Age interconnectedness had been a source of enormous strength during stable periods. Specialized regions could focus on their comparative advantages: Cyprus on copper, Afghanistan on tin, Egypt on grain, while relying on trade networks to supply their other needs. This specialization made the entire system more productive and efficient. But interconnectedness also created vulnerabilities. When trade routes were disrupted, specialized regions found themselves unable to obtain essential materials. When political relationships broke down, economic partnerships became impossible to maintain. When military innovations spread rapidly through connected networks, traditional defensive strategies became obsolete simultaneously across wide regions. The shift from chariot-based to infantry-based warfare illustrates this systemic vulnerability. Chariot armies required international cooperation to obtain horses, bronze, and specialized equipment. Infantry armies could be equipped locally with more readily available materials, making them less vulnerable to trade disruptions. The Bronze Age collapse thus represents not just military or political failure, but the breakdown of humanity's first experiment in large-scale economic and technological integration. The same interconnectedness that had created unprecedented prosperity made the system vulnerable to unprecedented collapse. 79. The democratization of violence. Iron's greater abundance, compared to bronze components, had profound social implications that extended far beyond military technology, fundamentally altering the balance of power between elites and commoners by making metal weapons more accessible to broader populations. This technological democratization reduced elite monopolies on the tools of violence and contributed to broader social transformations. Bronze Age warfare had been dominated by elites who could afford expensive bronze weapons, horse-drawn chariots, and specialized military training. The rarity of tin meant that bronze weapons were luxury items that marked social status as much as they served military functions. This scarcity helped maintain social hierarchies by ensuring that effective weapons remained concentrated in elite hands. Iron changed this equation completely. While ironworking required new technical knowledge, iron ore was available in many regions, making metal weapons potentially accessible to much broader populations. For the first time in human history, ordinary farmers and craftsmen could afford metal tools and weapons comparable to those used by elites. The social implications were revolutionary. Peasant communities could organize effective resistance against traditional authorities. Regional leaders could raise armies without depending on international bronze trade. Military power became less concentrated in traditional palace centers and more distributed among local communities. This democratization of military technology helps explain why recovery from the Bronze Age collapse often involved new forms of political organization that were less hierarchical and more responsive to broader populations than the palace systems they replaced. 80. The urban catastrophe. Archaeological evidence across the Bronze Age world reveals massive urban decline that affected settlement patterns for centuries. Though recent research shows this demographic catastrophe was neither universal nor uniform. While traditional scholarship claimed widespread destruction, only about 39% of sites traditionally considered destroyed actually show clear archaeological evidence of violent collapse around 1200 BCE. The sites that did experience genuine destruction often showed catastrophic abandonment that suggests demographic disaster of enormous scope. Regional surveys in areas like the Peloponnese indicate population decline of 75% or more, with vast areas that had supported dense populations for centuries becoming virtually uninhabited. This demographic collapse had profound implications for agricultural production, craft specialization, and cultural transmission. Without sufficient population to maintain terraced fields, sophisticated irrigation systems, and specialized workshops, much of the technological and cultural knowledge that had defined Bronze Age civilization simply disappeared. However, the uneven nature of this decline created opportunities as well as challenges. Regions that maintained stable populations found themselves in possession of territories and resources that had been abandoned by their neighbors. This probably contributed to the success of peoples like the Phoenicians and certain Cypriot communities. The pattern of selective urban decline also helps explain why recovery was so uneven. Areas that had experienced complete demographic collapse took centuries to rebuild sustainable communities, while regions that had maintained population continuity could adapt more quickly to changing conditions. 81. The fortress mentality. Archaeological evidence from sites across the eastern Mediterranean shows increased construction of hilltop fortifications and defensive settlements during and after the collapse period, indicating a fundamental shift from the confident, open settlement patterns of the Bronze Age to the defensive, insecure communities that would characterize much of the early Iron Age. Bronze Age settlements had often been located in fertile valleys, near harbors, or along major trade routes, positions chosen for economic advantage rather than defensive capability. The confidence to build in such exposed locations reflected the political stability and military security provided by palace-based administrative systems. The collapse shattered this confidence. New settlements increasingly appeared on hilltops, in naturally defensible positions, or behind massive fortification walls. These locations sacrificed economic convenience for military security, suggesting that violence and insecurity had become primary concerns for surviving communities. The fortress mentality wasn't just defensive, it was also isolationist. These new settlement patterns made trade and communication more difficult, contributing to the fragmentation of the interconnected Bronze Age world into smaller, more self-contained communities. However, this defensive adaptation also provided security that enabled survival and eventual recovery. The communities that successfully adapted to post-collapse conditions were often those that had made the hard choice to prioritize security over prosperity, at least temporarily. The proliferation of defensive settlements thus represents both the breakdown of Bronze Age security and the adaptation strategies that would eventually enable Iron Age recovery. 82. From cities to countryside. Population movement from urban centers to rural areas during the Bronze Age collapse represented a fundamental shift from the complex, specialized societies that had characterized late Bronze Age civilization toward more subsistence-based lifestyles that would dominate much of the subsequent Iron Age. This transformation had profound implications for social organization, economic production, and cultural development. Bronze Age urban centers had supported large populations through complex economic systems that included specialized craft production, long-distance trade, and agricultural surplus redistribution. These cities were centers of innovation, cultural development, and technological advancement that defined the character of Bronze Age civilization. The collapse destroyed the economic foundations that made urban life possible. Without palace-based redistribution systems, without reliable trade networks, without the security provided by professional military forces, urban populations found themselves unable to maintain their traditional way of life. rural areas offered advantages that cities couldn't provide during periods of crisis. Direct access to agricultural production, reduced dependence on trade networks, closer-knit communities that could provide mutual security and greater flexibility in responding to changing conditions. This urban-to-rural migration represents more than just demographic change. It was a transformation in how human societies organize themselves. The shift toward rural, subsistence-based communities marked the end of Bronze Age experiments in urban complexity and the beginning of simpler, but more resilient forms of social organization. 83. Following the environment. Archaeological surveys reveal that Bronze Age collapse settlement patterns showed evidence of habitat tracking. Populations moving in response to environmental changes and creating new demographic distributions across the Eastern Mediterranean as communities abandoned traditional territories in favor of regions that remained ecologically viable. This environmental migration wasn't random, but followed logical patterns based on resource availability and climatic conditions. As drought made some regions uninhabitable, populations moved toward areas with more reliable water sources. As agricultural zones shifted due to climate change, farming communities relocated to maintain their traditional livelihoods. The archaeological evidence for this habitat tracking includes the abandonment of settlements in areas that became too arid to support agriculture, the establishment of new communities near permanent water sources, and changes in site distribution that reflect adaptation to new environmental conditions. This pattern of environmental migration had profound cultural implications. Traditional territorial relationships were disrupted as populations moved into areas previously occupied by other groups. Established political boundaries became meaningless as environmental necessities overrode political arrangements. The habitat tracking phenomenon also helps explain why the Bronze Age collapse had such lasting effects. The environmental changes that drove population movements weren't temporary disruptions, but permanent shifts that required long-term adaptation. Communities couldn't simply wait for conditions to return to normal. They had to fundamentally reorganize their relationship with the landscape. 84. When the Earth shook. Archaeologists Amos Nur and Eric Klein's proposition that earthquake storms, sequences of major earthquakes, contributed to the Bronze Age collapse has added geological evidence to our understanding of this complex phenomenon. Their 2000 study documented seismic destruction evidence at multiple sites. The recent research suggests earthquakes were secondary factors that amplified other stresses rather than primary causes. The Eastern Mediterranean is seismically active, and archaeological evidence does show earthquake damage at several Bronze Age sites. At Mycenae, for example, human skeletons found crushed beneath collapsed architecture provide dramatic evidence of seismic disaster. Similar evidence appears at other sites across the region. However, the timing of these earthquakes is crucial for understanding their role in the collapse. Many occurred after political and economic systems were already under stress from other factors: drought, military pressure, trade disruption. The earthquakes may have delivered final blows to systems that were already failing rather than initiating the collapse process. The earthquake hypothesis also faces the challenge of explaining why seismic activity would increase specifically during the Bronze Age collapse period. While earthquakes certainly occurred, there's no evidence that seismic activity was unusually intense during the 13th and 12th centuries BCE compared to other periods. Nevertheless, earthquakes probably played important roles in specific regional contexts, particularly when they struck communities already weakened by other stresses. The earthquake evidence illustrates how multiple factors combine to create the perfect storm of Bronze Age collapse. 85. Volcanic shadows from the past. Research indicates that earlier volcanic events, including the massive Thera/Santorini eruption around 1600 BCE, may have contributed to long-term climate instability that weakened Bronze Age civilizations' resilience to later environmental stresses. While this eruption occurred centuries before the collapse, its effects may have created environmental vulnerabilities that made societies more susceptible to subsequent crises. The Thera eruption was one of the largest volcanic events in recorded human history, ejecting massive amounts of ash and gases into the atmosphere and causing temporary global climate cooling. While Bronze Age civilizations survived this immediate crisis, the long-term environmental effects may have been more subtle but equally significant. Volcanic events can alter atmospheric circulation patterns, disrupt seasonal weather cycles, and create long-term changes in precipitation and temperature patterns. These effects might not cause immediate civilizational collapse, but could create environmental instabilities that reduce society's ability to cope with later stresses. The volcanic shadow hypothesis suggests that Bronze Age civilizations were operating in an environmentally stressed condition for decades or centuries before the final collapse. When additional stresses appeared, drought, military pressure, economic disruption, these societies lacked the environmental buffer that might have enabled them to survive. This long-term environmental perspective helps explain why the Bronze Age collapse was so comprehensive and difficult to reverse. The civilizations that fell may have been operating at the margins of environmental sustainability, making them vulnerable to relatively small additional stresses. 86. Reading ancient climates. Speleothem analysis from Mavri Tripa Cave near Pylos provides direct evidence of environmental conditions during the Bronze Age collapse, showing generally wetter conditions during the late Bronze Age followed by significant drought around 3,200 years BP, combined with tree ring data from Anatolia and the Levant. This evidence confirms reduced rainfall during the critical late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE. Speleothems, cave formations like stalactites and stalagmites, function as natural climate archives, recording changes in precipitation and temperature through their chemical composition and growth patterns. The Mavri Tripa cave data provides high-resolution climate information spanning several millennia, allowing scientists to correlate environmental conditions with known historical events. The correlation between speleothem evidence and tree ring data from across the Eastern Mediterranean creates a consistent picture of environmental stress during the Bronze Age collapse period. Multiple independent sources confirm that this was a time of unprecedented drought and environmental disruption. Tree ring data from Anatolia and the Levant shows particularly severe conditions in the regions where some of the most dramatic collapses occurred. The Hittite Empire's core territories experienced some of the worst drought conditions, correlating with historical evidence of famine and administrative breakdown. This convergent evidence from multiple scientific sources provides strong support for the role of environmental stress in the Bronze Age collapse, while also revealing the complex relationship between climate change and social transformation. 87. The lake's memory. Core samples from the Sea of Galilee provide some of the most precise evidence for Bronze Age environmental conditions, showing over 100 years of severe drought between 1250 to 1100 BCE, confirmed through radiocarbon dating. This evidence offers direct confirmation of the environmental stress that accompanied and perhaps triggered the Bronze Age collapse. Lake sediment cores function like natural libraries, preserving annual layers that record environmental conditions with remarkable precision. Changes in sediment composition, mineral content, and biological remains reflect variations in precipitation, temperature, and ecological conditions that can be precisely dated using radiocarbon methods. The Sea of Galilee evidence is particularly significant because this region was one of the most fertile and well-watered areas in the ancient Near East. If even this favored location was experiencing unprecedented drought, conditions in more marginal areas must have been catastrophic for human communities dependent on agriculture. The 100-year duration of the drought is crucial for understanding its impact on Bronze Age societies. This wasn't a temporary crisis that communities could survive by using stored reserves. It was a permanent change in environmental conditions that required fundamental adaptation in agricultural practices and settlement patterns. The precision of the Sea of Galilee evidence also allows scientists to correlate environmental conditions with specific historical events, showing that the worst drought conditions coincided exactly with the period when major Bronze Age centers were experiencing their final collapses. 88. The death of knowledge. The Bronze Age collapse disrupted apprenticeship systems that had maintained technological knowledge for centuries, creating a crisis of skill transmission that contributed to the long-term loss of sophisticated techniques. Archaeological evidence from metallurgical sites shows that complex procedures like lost wax casting and precise bronze alloying became less standardized and sophisticated during and after the collapse period. Bronze Age craft production had depended on master-apprentice relationships that transmitted complex technical knowledge through hands-on training spanning years or decades. These systems were embedded in palace workshops, temple institutions, and family craft traditions that provided the social stability necessary for long-term skill development. The collapse destroyed many of these institutional contexts. Palace workshops were abandoned, temple support systems failed, and family craft traditions were disrupted by population movements and social upheaval. Without stable institutional support, the transmission of complex technical knowledge became much more difficult. Archaeological evidence shows the results. Metallurgical techniques became simpler and more variable. Pottery production lost its sophisticated standardization, and complex architectural traditions largely disappeared. This wasn't just economic decline, it was the loss of accumulated human knowledge. However, some knowledge did survive through adapted transmission systems. Craft communities that successfully reorganized themselves managed to preserve essential techniques, while other knowledge was simplified but not entirely lost. The collapse represented a filtering process that preserved some traditions while eliminating others. 89. The Pottery Revolution. Archaeological evidence shows that pottery production shifted dramatically from sophisticated palace-controlled systems to simpler, locally produced wares during the Bronze Age collapse. The standardized Mycenaean pottery styles that had been distributed across the Mediterranean were replaced by regional variants with less technical sophistication but greater local adaptation. Mycenaean pottery production had been highly centralized, with major workshops producing standardized vessels that served both practical and symbolic functions. These workshops maintained consistent quality standards, decorative traditions, and technical specifications that made Mycenaean pottery recognizable across vast distances. The collapse destroyed this centralized system. Without palace patronage and without access to specialized raw materials, pottery production became localized and simplified. Local communities developed their own styles using locally available materials and techniques that could be maintained without extensive institutional support. This transformation had broader implications beyond pottery itself. The standardized Mycenaean pottery had served as a kind of international currency that facilitated trade relationships across the Mediterranean. Its disappearance marked the end of integrated economic networks that had connected distant regions. However, the localization of pottery production also represented successful adaptation to changed circumstances. Communities that developed sustainable local pottery traditions maintained important technological capabilities that would prove valuable for eventual recovery. The Pottery Revolution illustrates both loss and resilience in the face of systemic collapse. 90. Art in transition. While the Bronze Age collapse generally resulted in declining artistic sophistication, archaeological evidence from sites like Carfi in Crete shows that some communities developed new artistic traditions during the transition period. Rather than simple cultural decline, the collapse period witnessed both losses and the emergence of new decorative styles adapted to change social and economic circumstances. Bronze Age artistic traditions have been closely tied to palace patronage and elite consumption. Sophisticated fresco painting, elaborate metalwork, and monumental sculpture required expensive materials, specialized training, and institutional support that disappeared with the palace systems. However, some communities successfully adapted their artistic traditions to new conditions. At Carfi, archaeologists have found evidence of innovative pottery decoration, new approaches to architectural ornament, and creative adaptations of traditional motifs to simpler production methods. These new artistic traditions often reflected different social values and economic realities. Without elite patronage, Art became more democratic and functional. Decorative styles emphasized local materials and techniques rather than expensive imported goods. Artistic expression adapted to serve community needs rather than royal display. The artistic transitions of the Bronze Age collapse illustrate broader patterns of cultural adaptation. While some sophisticated traditions were lost, communities that successfully navigated the crisis often developed new forms of cultural expression that proved more sustainable under changed conditions. 91. The Silent Centuries. The complete disappearance of Linear B during the Bronze Age collapse represents one of history's most dramatic examples of literacy loss, with writing not returning to Greece for centuries until the Phoenicians introduced their alphabet around 800 BCE. This 4-century gap in Greek literacy marked a fundamental break in cultural transmission that had profound implications for the preservation of Bronze Age knowledge and traditions. Linear B had been more than just a writing system. It was the technological foundation for Bronze Age administrative complexity. Palace scribes used Linear B to record tax collections, manage resource distribution, coordinate military activities, and maintain diplomatic correspondence. Without this recording capability, the complex administrative systems that had defined Mycenaean civilization became impossible to maintain. The loss of literacy also meant the loss of historical memory. While oral traditions preserved some cultural knowledge, the stories that would eventually become Homer's epics probably originated during this period. The detailed administrative, legal, and historical records that had characterized Bronze Age civilization simply vanished. The Phoenician alphabet that eventually reached Greece represented a completely fresh start rather than a revival of the old system. The new writing system was simpler and more democratic than Linear B, but the knowledge and cultural traditions that had been recorded in the earlier script were lost forever. The silent centuries between Linear B and the Greek alphabet illustrate how civilizational collapse can create permanent cultural discontinuities that affect development for centuries afterward. 92. Trade networks transformed. Post-collapse trade networks demonstrate that commercial exchange did not stop or decrease after 1200 BC, but rather fragmented into smaller, more localized systems that proved more resilient to political disruption. Archaeological evidence shows continued trade in essential materials like tin and lead, though the palace-controlled luxury trade largely disappeared. The transformation of trade networks reflects broader changes in political and economic organization. Bronze Age trade had been dominated by palace-based systems that could organize large-scale expeditions and maintain diplomatic relationships necessary for long-distance commerce. These centralized systems were efficient but vulnerable to political disruption. Post-collapse trade developed different characteristics: smaller scale, more diverse routes, greater reliance on private merchants rather than palace officials, and focus on essential materials rather than luxury goods. These new networks were less efficient but more adaptable to changing political conditions. Archaeological evidence shows that some crucial trades continued throughout the collapse period. Tin from Afghanistan continued to reach Mediterranean workshops, suggesting that someone maintained the complex logistics necessary for this essential commerce. Lead from Sardinia appears in Levantine contexts centuries after the supposed collapse. The persistence of essential trade relationships helped preserve important technological capabilities and cultural connections that would prove valuable for eventual recovery. While the Bronze Age's integrated global economy had disappeared, sufficient commercial activity survived to maintain some technological and cultural continuity. 93. Economic innovation in crisis. The collapse of palatial redistribution systems led communities to develop diverse economic arrangements that often proved more resilient than the centralized systems they replaced. Archaeological evidence shows communities developing alternative exchange networks and production systems that could function without the institutional support that had characterized Bronze Age economics. Bronze Age economies had been highly centralized, with palaces collecting agricultural surplus from wide territories and redistributing goods according to administrative priorities. This system could support large populations and complex undertakings, but was vulnerable to administrative breakdown or political disruption. Post-collapse communities developed more diverse economic strategies. Household-based production that reduced dependence on specialized workshops, local exchange networks that didn't require long-distance coordination, and more flexible arrangements that could adapt quickly to changing conditions. These new economic arrangements often involved innovations that hadn't been necessary during the Bronze Age. Communities developed new forms of cooperation, new methods for organizing production, and new approaches to resource management that reflected their changed circumstances. While overall prosperity declined, the new economic arrangements often provided greater security for ordinary people. Household-based production gave families more direct control over their economic survival, while local exchange networks created stronger community bonds that could provide mutual support during difficult periods. 94. Cyprus, maritime adaptation. Cyprus maintained extensive trade connections despite widespread collapse elsewhere, with archaeological evidence showing new maritime trading routes open to Crete in the Aegean and Sardinia in the central Mediterranean, as the island adapted to changing conditions by developing alternative commercial networks when traditional Bronze Age routes became unreliable. This Cypriot success represents one of the Bronze Age collapse's most remarkable adaptation stories. While mainland powers struggled with internal collapse and external pressures, Cyprus leveraged its maritime advantages to maintain and even expand its commercial reach. The development of new trade routes required considerable innovation and risk-taking. Cypriot merchants had to develop relationships with new partners, learn about unfamiliar markets, and adapt their products to different consumer preferences. This wasn't simply maintaining old trade patterns, but creating entirely new commercial networks. Archaeological evidence from Cyprus shows continued prosperity during the collapse period. New construction projects, sophisticated craft production, and evidence of expanding trade networks. Rather than decline, the island experienced what can only be described as a commercial renaissance. Cyprus's success illustrates the advantages of maritime orientation during periods of political instability. While land-based trade routes were vulnerable to military disruption and political breakdown, sea routes could be more easily redirected to avoid troubled areas and take advantage of new opportunities. 95. The Phoenician opportunity. The transformation of Mediterranean commerce during the Bronze Age collapse created opportunities that the Phoenicians were uniquely positioned to exploit, establishing new networks that would dominate Mediterranean trade for centuries. As palace-based trade systems disappeared, Phoenician city-states filled the commercial vacuum with more flexible and resilient business models. Phoenician success reflected several crucial advantages. Their maritime expertise allowed them to adapt trade routes quickly. Their decentralized city-state organization made them less vulnerable to single-point failures, and their commercial culture emphasized adaptability over institutional continuity. While Bronze Age trade had been dominated by palace officials managing state-sponsored expeditions, Phoenician commerce was organized around private merchants and family-based trading firms. This created more diverse and resilient commercial networks that could survive political disruptions that would have destroyed centralized systems. The Phoenicians also developed new approaches to long-distance trade that proved more sustainable than Bronze Age methods. Instead of temporary trading posts, they established permanent colonies that could provide secure bases for commercial operations across vast distances. Archaeological evidence shows Phoenician commercial expansion beginning almost immediately after the Bronze Age palace systems collapsed. Rather than trying to restore the old order, they created new forms of commercial organization that proved more durable and ultimately more successful than their predecessors. 96. Political reorganization. The Bronze Age collapse created opportunities for fundamental political innovation. With the emergence of new political formations, including the rise of Phoenician city-states, the development of the Kingdom of Israel, and the eventual Neo-Assyrian Empire representing wholesale reorganization of political authority rather than simple restoration of previous systems. Bronze Age political organization had been dominated by palace-based kingdoms that combined monarchical authority with complex bureaucratic administration. These systems were sophisticated but also rigid and vulnerable to the kinds of systemic stresses that characterized the collapse period. The new political formations that emerged from the collapse often developed different approaches to governance that proved more adaptable to post-Bronze Age conditions. Phoenician city-states emphasized commercial autonomy and maritime orientation. Early Israel developed new forms of tribal confederation and religious identity. The Neo-Assyrian Empire would eventually create more efficient and flexible imperial administration. These political innovations weren't simply responses to immediate crisis, but represented fundamental rethinking of how political authority could be organized and maintained. The collapse had demonstrated the vulnerabilities of Bronze Age political systems, creating both necessity and opportunity for experimentation with new approaches. The success of these new political formations suggests that the Bronze Age collapse, however destructive in the short term, may have cleared the way for more sustainable and adaptable forms of political organization that would characterize the Iron Age and beyond. 97. New peoples, new opportunities. The aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse saw the rise of new peoples and polities as the Phoenicians, Israelites, Arameans, and Philistines benefited from the withdrawal of Egyptian and Hittite power from the Levant. Rather than simply filling a vacuum, these groups established innovative political entities that would fundamentally reshape the ancient Near Eastern political landscape. The withdrawal of the great Bronze Age powers created unprecedented opportunities for regional development. Areas that had been peripheral territories of larger empires suddenly found themselves free to develop independent political and cultural institutions. The Phoenicians transformed themselves from Egyptian vassals into independent maritime powers that would dominate Mediterranean commerce. The Israelites developed new forms of religious and political organization that would prove extraordinarily influential. The Arameans created trading networks that would connect Mesopotamia with the Mediterranean. The Philistines established coastal city-states that would play crucial roles in regional politics. These new political formations often showed remarkable innovation in addressing the challenges that had overwhelmed their Bronze Age predecessors. They developed more flexible military organizations, more sustainable economic systems, and more adaptable political institutions. The success of these new peoples illustrates how the Bronze Age collapse created opportunities as well as challenges. While the immediate effects were destructive, the long-term consequences included political and cultural innovations that would shape the ancient world for centuries. 98. Neo-Hittite persistence. Major Neo-Hittite centers including Carchemish, Melid, Malatya, Aleppo, and Table successfully maintained distinct cultural identities even as they gradually fell under the control of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, demonstrating how cultural continuity could survive political subordination and providing successful adaptation models for post-Bronze Age conditions. The Neo-Hittite states represent remarkable examples of cultural resilience and political adaptation. Despite the complete collapse of the Hittite Empire, these successor states preserved essential elements of Hittite culture while successfully adapting to the changed political and economic conditions of the Iron Age. Their cultural persistence is visible in art, architecture, religious practices, and administrative traditions that showed clear continuity with imperial Hittite precedents. Royal inscriptions continued to use Luwian hieroglyphs and traditional formulas. Religious ceremonies maintained ancient ritual practices. Architectural styles preserved imperial Hittite conventions. However, this cultural continuity was combined with successful political adaptation. The Neo-Hittite states were smaller, more flexible, and more responsive to local conditions than the old empire had been. They successfully integrated with local populations while maintaining their distinctive identity. Their eventual incorporation into the Neo-Assyrian Empire was often achieved through negotiation rather than conquest, suggesting that these states had developed sustainable political arrangements that even expanding empires found valuable to preserve rather than destroy. 99. The democratic revolution in technology. The slow, comparatively continuous spread of ironworking technology, beginning in Bulgaria and Romania, provided societies with superior tools and weapons while democratizing technology that had previously been controlled by elite bronze-working specialists. This technological transformation had profound social implications that extended far beyond simple material improvements. Bronze technology had required access to rare tin sources and sophisticated trade networks that concentrated technological capabilities in the hands of elites who could afford to maintain international commercial relationships. Iron technology changed this equation by making metal tools accessible to much broader populations. The democratization process wasn't immediate or universal. Ironworking required different technical knowledge than bronze working, and early iron products were often inferior to bronze equivalents. However, iron's abundance and the independence it provided from long-distance trade networks made it increasingly attractive as Bronze Age commercial systems broke down. Archaeological evidence shows iron technology spreading through local innovation and adaptation rather than elite-controlled diffusion. Ordinary communities could experiment with ironworking without requiring institutional support or international connections. This technological democratization contributed to broader social changes that characterized the transition from Bronze Age to Iron Age societies. More equitable access to metal technology supported more egalitarian social arrangements and reduced the technological basis for elite dominance. 100. Strategies for survival. Archaeological evidence shows that surviving civilizations demonstrated varied resilience strategies that revealed different approaches to managing systemic crisis. Assyria used territorial contraction and military strength to preserve institutional continuity. Phoenicians leveraged maritime networks for commercial expansion, and Neo-Hittites maintained cultural continuity while adapting to new demographics and political realities. These different survival strategies illustrate the range of possible responses to systemic collapse. Rather than single correct approaches, successful adaptation required matching strategies to specific circumstances, capabilities, and opportunities. Assyrian contraction represents a strategy of managed retreat that preserved essential capabilities while abandoning unsustainable commitments. This required difficult decisions about what to preserve and what to sacrifice, but it successfully maintained the institutional knowledge and military traditions that would eventually enable dramatic expansion. Phoenician maritime expansion represents a strategy of creative adaptation that transformed crisis into opportunity. Rather than trying to restore traditional land-based systems, Phoenician city-states developed new forms of commercial organization suited to change conditions. Neo-Hittite cultural preservation represents a strategy of adaptive continuity that maintained identity while accepting political change. These communities successfully preserved essential cultural traditions while integrating with new populations and political arrangements. The diversity of successful strategies suggests that the Bronze Age collapse, while destructive, didn't predetermine specific outcomes, but rather created conditions where different forms of adaptation could succeed. 101. The scientific integration. Modern research combines archaeological evidence with paleoclimatic data, geological analysis, and historical sources using sophisticated integration techniques that provide more robust chronological frameworks than any single methodology could achieve. Speleothem analysis, tree ring data, and archaeological stratigraphy now work together to create unprecedented precision in understanding both timing and causation. This methodological integration represents a revolution in how scholars approach complex historical problems. Rather than relying on single lines of evidence that might be incomplete or misleading, contemporary research creates multiple independent tests of historical hypotheses. The integration process often reveals discrepancies between different types of evidence that force more sophisticated interpretations. When radiocarbon dates conflict with ceramic chronologies, or when paleoclimatic evidence doesn't match historical sources, researchers must develop more complex explanations that account for all available data. Advanced statistical techniques, particularly Bayesian analysis, allow researchers to combine different types of evidence while properly accounting for uncertainties and limitations. This creates chronological frameworks that are both more precise and more honest about their limitations. The result is understanding of the Bronze Age collapse that is more nuanced, more precise, and more reliable than earlier approaches based on single methodologies or unsupported assumptions. 102. Advanced archaeological techniques. Recent excavations employ microgeoarchaeology, paleobotanical analysis, and high-precision radiocarbon dating with emphasis on understanding formation processes and distinguishing between natural disasters and human conflict. Current work focuses on developing more sophisticated methods for identifying and dating destruction events with unprecedented precision and reliability. Microgeoarchaeological analysis allows researchers to examine destruction layers at microscopic levels, identifying specific indicators of burning, earthquake damage, or other destruction causes. This precision helps distinguish between different types of destruction events and their chronological relationships. Paleobotanical analysis of preserved plant remains provides direct evidence of environmental conditions, agricultural practices, and human diet during critical periods. This information helps researchers understand the relationship between environmental stress and social collapse. High-precision radiocarbon dating using accelerator mass spectrometry, AMS, techniques can now provide dates accurate to within decades, allowing much more precise correlation between different sites and types of evidence. Perhaps most importantly, contemporary archaeology emphasizes understanding how archaeological deposits actually formed rather than simply documenting what was found. This formation process approach helps distinguish between contemporary events and later disturbances that might confuse chronological interpretation. These advanced techniques are creating more reliable and detailed understanding of the Bronze Age collapse, while also revealing how much previous interpretations were based on incomplete or misunderstood evidence. 103. Standardizing destruction evidence. The field has developed more sophisticated methods for identifying and dating destruction events, with emphasis on standardized definitions of destruction events and more rigorous analysis of archaeological contexts. This methodological advancement addresses the problem of inconsistent standards that had allowed questionable destructions to influence scholarly understanding for decades. Standardization requires clear criteria for what constitutes evidence of destruction. Specific types of debris, particular patterns of artifact distribution, consistent chronological associations, and clear indicators of the destruction's cause and timing. The new standards also emphasize the importance of distinguishing between different types of destruction. Earthquake damage creates different archaeological signatures than military conquest. Accidental fires leave different evidence than deliberate burning. Natural abandonment creates different patterns than forced evacuation. Rigorous contextual analysis examines not just what was found, but where it was found, how it was deposited, and what its relationship is to other archaeological evidence. This helps prevent misinterpretation of later disturbances as Bronze Age destructions. The standardization process has revealed how many supposed Bronze Age destructions were based on inadequate evidence or misunderstood contexts. While this has reduced the number of confirmed destruction events, it has increased confidence in those that meet rigorous standards. 104. Beyond environmental determinism. Guy D. Middleton's 2024 review documents how collapse studies have matured from simple environmental determinism toward more nuanced approaches that consider human agency, resilience, and the complex interplay of factors. This theoretical evolution reflects broader, scholarly recognition that environmental change doesn't automatically produce social collapse, but rather creates conditions where human choices become crucial. Early collapse theories often treated environmental change as a simple mechanical cause that inevitably produced civilizational breakdown. Drought caused famine, which caused social unrest, which caused political collapse, a linear progression that left little room for human adaptation or innovation. Contemporary approaches recognize that human societies have considerable capacity for adaptation and that environmental stress often stimulates innovation rather than collapse. The key question isn't whether environmental change occurred, but how different societies responded to similar challenges. This approach emphasizes human agency, the choices that individuals and communities made about how to respond to stress, which adaptation strategies to pursue, and how to reorganize social and economic systems. Some choices proved more successful than others, creating the varied outcomes we see in the archaeological record. The mature understanding of collapse studies recognizes that environmental change, human choice, and social structure interact in complex ways that produce different outcomes in different contexts. This makes collapse studies more realistic, but also more complex and challenging to pursue. 105. The continuing evolution. Contemporary scholarship emphasizes the need for high-resolution, site-specific data rather than broad regional generalizations, with researchers working to dissolve the artificial separation between data, methodology, and theory in pursuit of more integrated and sophisticated understanding of how complex societies respond to systemic challenges. This methodological sophistication represents the maturation of Bronze Age collapse studies from a field dominated by grand theories and dramatic narratives toward one characterized by careful empirical work and theoretical nuance. The emphasis on high-resolution data reflects recognition that the collapse was more complex and variable than earlier generalizations suggested. The integration of data, methodology, and theory addresses a persistent problem in archaeological interpretation: the tendency to separate empirical observation from theoretical understanding in ways that reduce the sophistication of both. Contemporary approaches emphasize how theoretical frameworks shape data collection, while data discoveries force theoretical refinement. Site-specific focus reflects recognition that the Bronze Age collapse affected different communities in different ways, making broad generalizations misleading or simply wrong. Understanding requires attention to local contexts, specific circumstances, and particular adaptation strategies. The continuing evolution of Bronze Age collapse studies illustrates how archaeological understanding develops through the accumulation of better data, more sophisticated methods, and more nuanced theoretical frameworks. While major questions remain unresolved, the field has developed more reliable approaches to addressing them. Future research will likely continue this trend toward greater precision, more integration between different types of evidence, and more sophisticated understanding of how environmental change and human choice interact to produce historical outcomes.